Welcome to the historic Blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Now beginning with Story 1, Marriage Bargains in a Tuscan Village. Nestled in the sun-baked hills of 14th century Tuscany, near the commune of San Gimignano, life unfolded with a predictable rhythm. The clatter of wooden wheels along dusty roads, the chiming of a village bell to mark canonical hours, and the endless scratching of hoes in dry soil formed the backdrop to a world defined not by grandeur, but by survival. In this world, marriage was not a matter of love or even lust, it was barter. More precisely, it was a survival pact negotiated between families, cloaked in religious ritual and community custom. In the eyes of the church, marriage was a sacrament, but for the villagers of Cal di Valdelsa, it was an investment, and at the heart of that investment was a girl's dowry. A girl's worth in goods. Consider Lucia, the daughter of a modest tenant farmer. Her dowry was being assembled years before she even reached adolescence. Her mother, Isabetta, had been setting aside lengths of woven linen since Lucia's birth. A pair of copper cooking pots, slightly dented but still serviceable, sat reserved in the corner of their home. A goat, lean but still producing milk, had been promised by her father. Every item was part of a quiet accounting process. In the peasant economy, where coins were scarce and barter was common, these dowries often consisted of textiles, animals, tools, and occasionally a bit of land. The dowry was less a gift than a guarantee, an assurance that the daughter would not burden her husband, and a symbol of the bride's legitimacy as a future matron. Dowries were recorded orally or, if one was fortunate enough to have a notary in the area, in brief contracts scratched onto parchment. For those like Lucia's family, the church played a pivotal role not only in blessing the union, but also in keeping informal records through the parish priest's memory or his marginalia. The marriage pact in the bed. Once Lucia turned 14, the canonical age for marriage, her family began serious negotiations with the family of a neighboring boy, Matteo. Matteo's father had a plot of land that bordered theirs and a second son to establish. The boy had calloused hands, a decent reputation, and his own plow. That, in 14th century Tuscany, was enough. The discussions took place quietly between fathers, sometimes mothers. Occasionally, a local priest would be consulted to ensure that the couple weren't too closely related. Canon law forbade marriages within the fourth degree of consanguinity, though dispensations were sometimes obtained. In practice, many village marriages danced on the edge of this prohibition, with overlapping kin lines impossible to untangle. The agreement settled on Lucia's dowry: the goat, 2 large linen sheets, a chest of wool, a frying pan, and a set of wooden bowls. In exchange, Matteo's family pledged a suitable home and the formal responsibilities of a husband. Notably, these included not just shelter and food, but sexual rights, fidelity, or the approximation of it, and the generation of children. Marriage rituals themselves were often modest in rural communities. A blessing at the church, perhaps followed by a small feast of lentils and bread. The consummation of the marriage was a community matter witnessed, or at least heard, by family and neighbors through thin wooden walls or stone rooms. Households and hierarchy. Once married, Lucia became mistress of a small 2-room house. Her tasks were relentless. She rose with the dawn to fetch water from the communal well. She boiled lentils with wild herbs, swept floors with heather brooms, and tended to their shared goat. Matteo expected her to bear children quickly. By her 16th year, she had already buried one stillborn and nursed another infant who cried through the night. Their family was part of a Mesadria system sharecroppers who owed half their crops to a landowning family living in the stone manor on the hill. This economic reality shaped every domestic decision. A poor harvest meant hunger. A pest infestation meant going into debt to the local miller. Yet even in hardship, the family unit was the bedrock of labor. Husbands and wives worked together in the fields. Children became workers by age 5. Grandparents helped when they could, although few lived long enough to see their grandchildren. In this tightly wound economic web, marriage wasn't a romantic ideal. It was a labor contract, a property exchange, and a social necessity. Custom meets canon. The church's influence remained strong, especially in Tuscany's deeply religious countryside. While canon law demanded mutual consent from both bride and groom, enforcement of this was inconsistent. Priests were often more concerned with whether the couple planned to raise children in the faith than whether the bride had genuinely agreed. Lucia likely said little during her wedding ritual. A nod, a word of assent, sigh, lo voglio was enough. The rest of the ritual unfolded in Latin, distant, formulaic, holy. But marriage was not immutable. If Matteo were to leave Lucia or prove abusive, she could, in theory, appeal to the bishop's court for separation a mensa et tharo from bed and board. Such appeals were rare, costly, and often unsuccessful for peasant women. The social cost of challenging a husband was immense, so Lucia, like most, endured. Threads of the dowry, threads of power. Dowries were not simply about material goods. They were threads tying families together economically, socially, and legally. If Matteo died, Lucia's dowry became a point of negotiation again. Her in-laws might claim rights to the goat or the chest of wool. She might be sent back to her parents with little more than the clothes she wore. Some dowries were returned, some weren't. The legal boundaries were hazy in rural areas, where memory and rumor served as records more often than parchment. Even decades later, old dowry disputes could surface in court. One case from nearby Siena records a widow suing her brother-in-law over a set of linen sheets taken after her husband's death. The court sided with the brother-in-law, claiming the woman had no surviving children to uphold her claim. A world balanced on quiet exchanges. Lucia's story is not unique. It is the story of thousands of peasant women across Europe during the Middle Ages. Their marriages were small acts with large consequences binding land, labor, lineage, and law. As we reflect on Lucia's modest dowry and her quiet endurance, a question lingers. In a world where every bull and goat carried weight, how did women like Lucia carve agency out of such confined spaces? The morning light in the Tuscan countryside came gently, less a grand arrival than a quiet revealing. The air was filled with dew, smoke from cooking fires, and the occasional clucking of chickens. Lucia, now in her late 20s, moved with practiced precision. Her hands, once soft, were hardened from years of kneading dough, milking goats, and lifting children. She had lost 2 in infancy, but 3 had survived, and the eldest was now 7, already carrying water and helping gather kindling. Lucia's marriage to Matteo was functional, occasionally warm, but never romantic. He was not cruel, nor especially kind. Like most men in the village, he viewed his wife primarily through the lens of labor and lineage. Her value was measured in how well she kept the household running, how healthy their children were, and whether their plot of land yielded enough wheat to fulfill their obligations to the estate above them. But just as the rhythms of peasant life seemed eternal, change crept in, quiet, disruptive, and often irreversible. What happens when a husband dies? When Matteo collapsed while lifting a sack of grain during the late harvest, no one expected him to survive. The priest administered last rites. The neighbors spoke of bad omens, perhaps the heat, perhaps a punishment for working on a feast day. Within days, Lucia was a widow. In medieval Europe, Widowhood transformed a woman's legal and social status instantly. She was no longer under a husband's guardianship. In theory, she gained a degree of autonomy, especially over her dowry property. In practice, it was never so simple. Lucia now had to prove what part of their meager holdings had been hers to begin with. The goat had long since died. The linen had been woven into shirts. The copper pot bore her mother's initials, but Matteo's brothers claimed it as family property. With no formal written dowry contract, the division of goods relied on memory, and memory was slippery. Neighbors remembered different things. The parish priest, who might have helped verify her claims, had died the previous winter. Even Matteo's own father seemed vague, perhaps conveniently, about the details. The children's share. Lucia's primary concern was her children. Under customary Tuscan law, especially in rural communities, sons could inherit land, but mothers were expected to serve as temporary custodians. As long as Lucia did not remarry, she would likely be allowed to stay in the home and manage the property for her son's future. But this was more courtesy than codified right. If she remarried, however, her late husband's kin could legally demand her removal, or at least insist that she forfeit any claim to land held in Matteo's name. They feared her new husband would take control of their family's assets. Lucia's position was precarious. Too old to be considered a young bride, too young to live entirely on the charity of her sons, she walked a narrow path. There was no inheritance in the modern sense, no will, no probate. Instead, what followed were weeks of tense visits, negotiations with her brothers-in-law, and subtle inquiries from neighboring widowers or childless bachelors. Legal mechanisms and customary courts. In Florence or Siena, a widow like Lucia might have taken her claims to the podesta, a city-appointed magistrate who managed rural disputes. But the journey was long, the fees high, and the outcomes uncertain. Most village women opted instead for informal arbitration, gatherings at the churchyard or in the presence of the village elder. Peasant women had few rights in theory, but they often carved them in practice through endurance and social pressure. Lucia relied on her standing as a respectable wife and mother. She had borne children, kept house, worked the land. Her in-laws, though not legally required to support her, would risk community disapproval if they turned her out too quickly. Still, disputes about dowries and property were common. In one surviving record from near Volterra, a widow spent 10 years trying to retrieve her dowry goods from her husband's family. She eventually won, but by then her children were grown, and she had lived those years in near poverty. Lucia knew such stories. She had heard them whispered at the well. She had no desire for a legal fight. Instead, she negotiated. Widowhood as freedom. While widowhood brought vulnerability, it also offered something rarely afforded to married women: independence. No longer under the direct control of a husband, widows could, within limits, manage their own affairs. Lucia joined other widows in the village in harvesting herbs, weaving linen, and even selling preserved olives at the market in San Gimignano. With her modest earnings, she bought a new hen and repaired the leaking roof. Widowhood allowed her to attend village meetings without needing permission, to speak directly with the parish priest about her son's baptism, and to avoid the gaze of a drunken husband during feast days. Many medieval widows chose not to remarry, not only to retain control over property, but because marriage brought risk of pregnancy, of losing autonomy, of being subject to another man's will. In some cases, widows joined confraternities or religious groups that supported each other in mutual aid. But freedom was always relative. A single poor harvest could send a family into debt. A sick child could force a widow to remarry for support. The freedom of widowhood was always balanced against the demands of survival. Threads of sisterhood and support. Lucia's days remained full. Her daughters helped with spinning and meal preparation. Her son, now 9, began plowing under the supervision of a neighbor. Other widows in the village formed a quiet alliance, watching each other's children, exchanging loaves of bread, lending each other a measure of salt or grain. In the records of rural Italian confraternities, we see glimpses of this informal support network. Widows who helped bury the dead, who prayed together at Marian festivals, who shared food during Lent. These networks often escaped formal documentation, but they were vital to the social fabric. And yet, these alliances had limits. One widow took in a cousin's daughter, but was later forced to give her up when she couldn't pay the parish tax. Another tried to send her son to apprentice in Siena, but couldn't afford the travel cost. Lucia balanced carefully between mutual aid and self-reliance. Her dignity lay not in bold gestures, but in daily persistence. Dowries revisited, dowries recycled. As her eldest daughter approached the age of 12, Lucia began thinking again in terms of dowry. The cycle repeated. She began setting aside wool. A neighbor gifted her a broken stool which she mended. A clay jug replaced a cracked one. What had once been her dowry and then her household goods were now to become part of her daughter's marriage negotiation. This recycling of goods was common. Dowries flowed through generations, modified and adapted. In some families, a single copper pan might pass through 5 marriages. Lucia wanted her daughter to have a better start than she had. She hoped to marry the girl to the son of a baker, someone with a steady trade and perhaps a home with a tiled floor. But times were changing. The Black Death had swept through the region a generation earlier, and its demographic scars lingered. Labor shortages had slightly improved bargaining power for peasants. Still, expectations remained humble. Would her daughter have a say in her marriage? Would she inherit anything? Or would her dowry, like Lucia's, be swallowed into another family, only to be contested if tragedy struck? The fragility of family ties. In medieval Tuscany, family was less a matter of affection than of function. Kinship ties meant shared responsibility, especially economic, but these ties could fray. After Matteo's death, Lucia found herself subtly pushed to the margins of her husband's lineage. His brothers spoke less to her. Their wives offered fewer invitations. Without Matteo as a bridge, her status diminished. This was not unusual. Widows often became socially invisible. Their opinions mattered less. Their roles were confined to modest matriarchs, watching over children and whispering prayers. But some resisted. A record from 1361 details a widow in Lucca who sued her brother-in-law for fencing off part of her garden. She appeared in court twice, testified clearly, and won partial restitution. The record notes her age, 53. Persistence, not privilege, had carried the day. Lucia, now 30, still had time. The unwritten legacy. As Lucia scraped together her daughter's dowry, she joined a quiet, centuries-long tradition. Women passing goods, values, and stories through hands rather than ink. Few peasants left wills. Even fewer women did. But their decisions shaped the landscape all the same. The field boundaries marked by stones, chosen during dowry agreements. The recipe passed between generations, preserved by a widow's memory. The woolen cloak given at a wedding, repaired and rewoven countless times by matriarchs. Lucia would never be remembered in books. No statue would bear her name. But her life, like those of so many medieval women, formed the warp and weft of rural European society. As her daughter looked toward marriage, Lucia wondered, would the cycle continue unchanged, or would the next generation of women demand something more than the quiet dignity of endurance? The rhythms of village life never stopped. Even when the seasons changed, when frost killed the last vines, or when summer heat cracked the soil, the work endured. For Lucia, the years passed through chores, births, small illnesses, and modest rituals. Feast days, baptisms, and the ever-present Sunday Mass. Her children aged before her eyes. Her hands thickened with age. And yet she remained the same Lucia who had once watched her parents haggle over her dowry in whispered tones near the hearth. Now she was the one whispering, preparing a daughter. Lucia's eldest daughter, Katerina, had just turned 13. In canon law, she was legally marriageable. In village custom, she was already late. The local miller's wife had recently given birth to a son, and the family was already discussing alliances. Lucia, knowing her position as a dowry-poor widow, worked quietly but relentlessly to improve her daughter's marital prospects. The bundle she assembled over 5 years was modest, but meaningful. A worn but functional copper pot, polished until it gleamed. 3 linen sheets, one with hand-stitched floral hems. A chest of wool, spun and dyed with onion skin for a pale yellow hue. 1 pair of leather sandals, purchased from a traveling cobbler. A small wooden crucifix, carved by Katerina's brother. The dowry had a dual function. It was both a bride's offering and a mark of her mother's skill. Each item was a record of resilience. Every stitch, every saved coin, every repaired handle reflected Lucia's commitment to her daughter's future. Still, without land or silver coin, Lucia's options were limited. Marriage markets and silent calculations. Rural matchmaking in Tuscany was not spontaneous. It wasn't driven by romantic affection, but neither was it entirely without sentiment. Families considered practical compatibility, adjoining fields, shared tools, reliable sons, manageable tempers. Reputation mattered, and so did debts. Lucia negotiated with a cooper's family from a neighboring village. The son, Tommaso, was broad-shouldered, quiet, and known to finish his tasks. His family's assets were humble: some woodworking tools, a pig, and access to firewood, but reliable. What sealed the agreement wasn't love or even ambition. It was stability. 2 families that could survive better together than apart. They made the deal beneath the shade of an old olive tree after Sunday Mass. Lucia's brother served as witness. The cooper's wife inspected Katerina's needlework. They shook hands. It was done. The ceremony and the feast. Katerina's wedding ceremony was held in the small stone chapel at the edge of the village. The priest, already familiar with both families, mumbled the Latin rites with weary efficiency. Katerina's veil was simple, a bleached linen cloth pinned with an iron brooch borrowed from her mother. There was no procession, no lute players, no gilded chalices, only bread, wine, and a meal of chickpeas with garlic and oil. Yet there was joy. The children played. An old man recited a proverb about marriage and grain. Someone sang. In a world where so much hinged on the unpredictable weather, pests, illness, the certainty of a wedding offered a kind of peace. A bridge had been built between 2 houses. Continuity had been affirmed. For Lucia, watching her daughter take a husband's hand, it was a moment of triumph wrapped in humility. Household cycles and the weight of repetition. Within weeks, Katerina assumed the rhythms of married life that Lucia had known so well. Rise before the sun, boil water, tend livestock, bear children, repeat. But change, though slow, was inevitable. The increasing presence of parish registries, diocesan courts, and notarial contracts in the 15th century began to standardize marriages, dowries, and even household disputes. While urban elites benefited most, even rural families like Lucia's began to feel the edges of administrative reach. Lucia had once relied on oral agreements and village memory. Now the priest urged her to put Katerina's dowry in writing for her protection, he said. A visiting notary, paid partly in grain, recorded the items in shaky Latin on rough parchment. It was filed in the church's chest. The document was not just a formality. It was a recognition of Katerina's rights, however faint, in a male-dominated world. Women in records, women in silence. The few surviving documents from villages like Lucia's often show only men's names: fathers, husbands, lords, notaries. Women appear as attachments: daughter of, wife of, widow of. But every scrap of information suggests a deeper, lived reality. One village tax roll from 1395 lists Lucia's neighbor, Antonia, as a head of household, a rare designation for a woman. Church records from the same region show women testifying in dowry disputes, participating in Saints' Day festivals, and even donating modest sums to maintain chapels. Lucia herself never learned to write, but she knew how to read the world to understand seasons, facial expressions, patterns of gossip, and the subtle shift in how people treated her. These were literacies of survival. Her legacy wasn't on parchment. It lived in custom, memory, and repetition. Generational shifts. As Katerina raised children of her own, Lucia took on the role of grandmother, an often overlooked pillar in medieval family life. Grandmothers passed down herbal knowledge, soothed crying bobbies, taught girls how to weave, and mediated disputes between daughters-in-law and mothers-in-law. Lucia, by then in her late 40s, found a strange comfort in this role. She was no longer central, but she was no longer burdened by the same expectations. She had raised a family, survived widowhood, and established her daughter. For women like Lucia, survival wasn't about dramatic acts. It was about the accumulation of small victories, a warm meal, a healthy child, a repaired wall. These were the victories that kept villages standing. Echoes in the landscape. Even today, the Tuscan hills are scattered with traces of medieval peasant life: stone ruins, terraced fields, olive groves planted by hands like Lucia's. Recent archaeological studies near San Gimignano have uncovered clay cooking pots, broken spindle whorls, and charred bread ovens. Soil analysis shows the long-term impact of peasant crop rotations and sharecropping systems. Some rural churches still house baptismal fonts used by families like Lucia's. Though nameless in official records, these women shaped the texture of the land itself. What did it mean to be a wife? Looking back, one must ask, what did marriage mean to Lucia? It wasn't a choice she made freely. It wasn't love as we define it today. But it was her path to respectability, to continuity, and to a kind of power: quiet, domestic, enduring. Her dowry was small, her marriage unrecorded by any chronicler, and yet she had transformed raw wool into clothing, small savings into stability, and her daughter's wedding into a legacy. Lucia's story was not about fame or revolution. It was about the way ordinary women shaped the medieval world by surviving it, adapting to it, and gently bending it toward the needs of their children. Legacy in silence. In the end, there is no grave with Lucia's name that survives. No chronicle sings her praises, but her impact was generational. Katerina's daughter would inherit a piece of that linen. Perhaps her son would one day tell his children that his grandmother made the best chestnut soup in the village. Perhaps a saying she coined, something dull but comforting, would pass through 5 generations without anyone knowing its source. This is how peasant women of the Middle Ages became immortal, not in stone or scroll, but in habits, recipes, rituals, and resilience. As twilight fell one evening in her daughter's kitchen, Lucia watched her grandchildren play by the fire and thought quietly to herself. Was it enough to have endured, or had she, in her own way, helped shape a better path forward for those who would marry after her, who would carry bowls and goats and linens into futures she could not imagine? Story 2. A lord's marriage for land and legacy. In a cold stone hall in the northern reaches of Aquitaine in the early 13th century, beneath the muted tapestries and flickering light of tallow candles, a young nobleman waited. He was 23, tall and restless. His name was Lord Amory de St. Vincent, the second son of a minor noble house that had, through careful loyalty to the Plantagenets, risen in local prominence. He had returned from 2 years of military service, freshly knighted, and now stood before the great responsibility that had awaited him since birth: not battle, not estate management, but marriage. Marriage for a man like Amory was no personal affair. It was strategy, it was law, it was survival, and it was not his choice to make. Marriage among the nobility, a game of inheritance. Unlike the peasantry, for whom marriage was a practical matter of labor and survival, the noble class treated marriage as a political maneuver. Families married not for affection, but for land, alliances, and lineage. It was a duty passed from father to son, a careful balancing of resources and reputations. In Amory's case, the need was urgent. His elder brother, Baldwin, had died in a joust the previous summer, leaving no heirs. That made Amory the new heir to the St. Vincent holdings, 3 villages, a small fortress, and a patch of disputed land bordering the estate of the powerful Rochefort family. With Baldwin gone, the St. Vincent line teetered. A marriage had to be made, a son had to be born, and quickly. Negotiating a noble match. The bride selected for Amory was a woman he had never met. Isabeau de Rochefort, 17 years old, educated at a Benedictine abbey, and daughter to Lord Thierry de Rochefort, Amory's most convenient enemy. The Rochefort family was wealthier, more influential, and boasted direct blood ties to the Capetians. They also possessed a claim, albeit a weak one, to a narrow strip of forested land that bordered both families' estates. That land had been the subject of decades of friction, skirmishes, and legal appeals to the court in Poitiers. The solution, as often in medieval noble disputes, was marriage. The lords, both aging and increasingly concerned about stability, agreed to a match between their children. The terms were precise, negotiated over 6 weeks through clerks and messengers. Isabeau would bring a dowry of 400 silver livres, 2 cart horses, and a small estate near Montcontour. The disputed forest land would be held jointly, with hunting rights equally shared. The first son of the union would inherit both the St. Vincent and Rochefort claims. Should Isabeau die without issue, the dowry would revert to the Rochefort family. Should Amory die before Isabeau, she would retain use of the estate for life, a dower right customary in noble contracts. The contract was sealed, signed by both patriarchs, and blessed by a representative of the bishop. Amory was informed the next day. The bride in her preparation. Isabeau de Rochefort had spent the past 6 years in the Abbey of Sainte Marie. There she had learned Latin psalms, French courtly manners, and the management of a noble household. Her training emphasized virtue, modesty, and obedience, but also the practical tasks of estate management, correspondence, and herbal medicine. She had been groomed for this role since childhood. A second daughter, she was considered unfit for an abbess's life, but too valuable to remain unmarried. Her marriage prospects had been discussed since she was 12. When informed of her engagement to Amory, she did not cry or rejoice. She quietly requested new shoes and set about embroidering her own bridal veil, a task that would take weeks. For noblewomen like Isabeau, marriage was a fate rather than a choice, but it was not always a misfortune. A good marriage could bring social power, security, and even a limited form of influence, provided one played the role well. The ceremony and the power of ritual. Their wedding took place at the chapel of St. Gabriel, with both families in attendance and banners displayed. It was not merely a religious affair, it was a spectacle of status. A bishop officiated. A scribe recorded the event. Guests dined on salted pork, honeyed bread, and imported wine. Troubadours recited verses that alluded gently to the joining of swords and branches. This was no romantic tale, but everyone knew how to play the part. The moment that mattered most was not the vows, but the giving of the hand when Isabeau's father placed her right hand in Amory, before the priest, symbolizing the legal transfer of guardianship. This was manual tradition, one of the oldest forms of marriage ritual under canon law. Next came the consent clause required since the 12th century reforms of Gratian's decretum. The couple had to speak their mutual agreement aloud, in Latin. Ego accipioti in uxorem. Ego accipioti in verum. Their voices echoed under the vaulted roof. From that moment their fates were bound. Consummation as confirmation. Despite all the public ritual, the true validation of the marriage came in private. Consummation was required for a marriage to be considered legally indissoluble. If a noble couple never consummated their marriage, it could be annulled and their lands, alliances, and agreements could be nullified. In some cases, witnesses were present to verify the consummation indirectly, either by remaining nearby or inspecting the sheets. This was less common by the 13th century, but still occasionally recorded in royal and noble contracts. For Aimery and Isabeau, the first night was more ceremonial than intimate. They were strangers, bound by duty, but they knew what was expected. No record survives of that night, only the silence of generations. Marriage as diplomacy. The union between Aimery and Isabeau quickly bore fruit, not just in the form of a son, born 2 years later, but in stabilizing the region. The disputed forest land saw no further skirmishes. Joint hunting parties became a new custom. Clerks from both houses began collaborating on grain records and tithe collections. Aimery assumed command of the household, but Isabeau managed the internal economy, food storage, linen accounts, servants' wages. She became known for her quiet efficiency. Their marriage was not passionate, but it was productive, the medieval ideal. No scandals, no annulments, no civil war, just stability. And in a world shaped by dynastic collapse, crusading debts, and peasant uprisings, stability was the rarest kind of success. The legal weight of marital unity. Canon law, shaped by Gratian and later confirmed by the papal decrees of Alexander III, held that marriage was based on mutual consent, and once consummated, was indissoluble. This gave both Aimery and Isabeau a powerful kind of legal protection. Their lands could not be seized due to marital impropriety. Their children were indisputably legitimate, and should either attempt to leave the marriage, whether through abandonment or appeals to Rome, they would find themselves in violation of both religious law and feudal custom. In essence, the marriage was a legal fortress. But even fortresses can decay. A marriage of shadows. By their 7th year of marriage, the alliance had cooled. Letters between their fathers had grown formal. Isabeau had borne only one son. A second child, a daughter, died at birth. Rumors spread whispers of barrenness, of divine displeasure. Aimery spent more time in Poitiers. Isabeau withdrew into prayer and estate ledgers. Still, they remained married. They attended Mass together. They oversaw the harvest. They posed together for a family tapestry. Noble marriages were never expected to be passionate. They were expected to endure. And endure they did. As Aimery rode to court one spring morning, he thought not of Isabeau or his estate, but of a question that rarely left him. If marriage was duty, and duty brought peace, did happiness have any place within it at all? 7 years had passed since Lord Aimery de Saint Vincent and Isabeau de Rochefort were joined in holy and strategic matrimony. Their son, Jean, now 5, was showing promise, a quiet boy, observant, already shadowing the steward through the storehouses and learning the names of tenants. Yet beneath the appearance of noble stability, pressure was mounting. The couple had no other living children. That fact alone made the future uncertain. For noble houses in 13th century France, a single heir was never enough. The dangers of illness, accidents, and war meant that families ideally sought multiple sons to ensure inheritance, reinforce marriages, and defend their claims. A noble line without a spare heir was a house built on a single beam. The burden of lineage. The emphasis on succession was not simply cultural, it was legal. Under customary Frankish law, particularly in regions influenced by the Capetian dynasty, primogeniture had become the dominant model, where the eldest son inherited all, and younger sons were expected to seek the church or military service. But what if the eldest son died? Without a second son, the estate might fracture, be challenged by cousins, or worse, revert to the crown. This fear haunted families like the St. Vincents. Amory's uncle, years earlier, had lost his claim to an estate near Cognac after the sudden death of his only son during a pilgrimage to Santiago. The estate was seized by a distant cousin who had quietly gathered witnesses and presented forged oaths. These memories loomed large. Church courts and marital concerns. By their 8th year of marriage, Amory's family, particularly his aging father, Lord Gervais, began to question the union's fruitfulness. Whispers emerged. Perhaps the marriage had been invalid. Perhaps a consanguinity clause had been overlooked. Canon law offered one path out of an unproductive noble marriage: annulment. Annulment was not divorce. It claimed that the marriage had never been valid to begin with due to coercion, fraud, close kinship, impotence, or prior vows. But annulments required formal petitions to ecclesiastical courts, credible evidence or noble support, papal confirmation in high-ranking cases, and in some cases, public scandal. Amory resisted. Despite the pressure, he remained loyal to the marriage, not out of affection, necessarily, but from a sense of duty and distrust of alternatives. Isabeau, too, was aware. She increased her presence in the chapel, made donations to a nearby convent, and offered masses for fertility. But children did not come. Isabeau's role, power behind the veil. In many noble marriages, women wielded power through stewardship and patronage. Though excluded from direct legal rule, they controlled the flow of domestic life, household staff, gift-giving, and religious affiliations. Isabeau used her time wisely. She strengthened ties with the abbey where she had studied, endowing them with land for their herb garden. She funded the copying of 2 psalters, one of which now resides in a manuscript library in Tours bearing a dedication in Latin: Pro anima Isabi, Domina de Sancto Vincent. She also mentored young noble girls sent to the estate for refinement. In doing so, she created a network of social dependents, many of whom would go on to become the wives of nearby barons, merchants, and knights. These alliances, while informal, were potent. While Amory hunted or rode to court, Isabeau ran the household. Her letters to her steward were firm and literate. She inspected granaries herself, demanded precise accounting of cheese stores, and refused to host visiting knights without prior notice. Among the servants and tenants, she was known sometimes in admiration, sometimes in fear as La Dame Juste. Loss and memory. In the spring of their 9th year, Isabeau bore a child, a daughter. The birth was long and difficult. The infant lived only 2 days. Isabeau named her Marie before placing her, wrapped in cloth, in the chapel crypt. The grief, though largely unspoken, altered the rhythm of the household. The tapestries were removed for cleaning. Mass was held every morning for a month. Isabeau remained in her chamber, dressed in gray, and took only bread and water. Amory withdrew as well, riding for a fortnight to visit a cousin in Limoges. Upon returning, he brought with him a new priest, Father Eloy, who had studied in Paris and was said to be a man of learning. The rumor among the household was simple: Amory had gone to seek religious advice on annulment, on dispensations, on the future of the line. Annulment and the politics of papal law. Had Amory pursued annulment, he would have had to initiate proceedings through the local episcopal court. From there, a case could escalate to the Court of Arches in Rome. These proceedings were complex, slow, and political. A nobleman might argue that the marriage had not been consummated, unlikely after a decade; that a pre-contract with another woman had invalidated the union, rare and dangerous to claim; that the couple were too closely related within the prohibited degrees, often claimed, but hard to prove. In fact, the church allowed cousin marriages up to the 4th degree, but local practice often demanded dispensations, a kind of spiritual permit. The lack of one could be used, retroactively, as grounds for annulment. But here lay the risk. If Amory annulled the marriage, his son Jean would be declared illegitimate, and illegitimate sons under both church and feudal law could not inherit. That was a risk he could not afford. The testament of Lord Gervase. In the midst of these uncertainties, Amory's father, Lord Gervase, grew ill. The old man summoned a notary to draft his will. In it, he declared Jean the rightful heir and requested that Amory refrain from rash counsel regarding his noble lady. He died the following winter and was buried in the family crypt beneath St. Vincent's Chapel. His death cemented Jean's status, at least for now. With a will, the child had formal recognition as heir. The question of annulment was buried with Gervase. Isabeau resumed her role more quietly, more devoutly. Her hair grayed, her gaze grew distant, but she endured. Amory's attentions drifted toward politics. With the Capetians growing stronger and Plantagenet control weakening in the region, he began corresponding with lords from both sides. His marriage, now no longer a negotiation, became a containment, stable but fragile. A marriage preserved in archives. Records from the St. Vincent estate during this period show routine activity. Payments to masons repairing the curtain wall. A purchase of 4 oxen. A tithe to a monastery for prayers, for the health of the lord and lady. The marriage faded into the background, as it was meant to. But beneath the silence lay the tension of unfulfilled expectations. One surviving letter from Isabeau to her brother, a knight in Angoulême, reveals something rare, a personal voice. My duty is done but not complete. They say a house is firm if the walls are of stone, yet I have found that the mortar must be blood and ours is thin. Still I remain, for who else will? Tell our sister I have taken to mending old altar cloths. There is comfort in thread. A noblewoman's sorrow, stitched into linen. As the estate prepared for Jean's formal education and lordship training, Amory sat alone one night in the solar, staring at the family's lineage chart, names stretching back 3 generations, and only one forward. He wondered, what legacy could he truly claim, one of duty, or one of quiet resignation? The banners still hung in the hall, though they had faded with the years. The colors of St. Vincent and Rochefort, once vibrant with deep blue and golden antlers, were now dulled by soot and time. In the hearth below them, the fire crackled low, echoing in a hall that had grown more quiet, more shadowed with each passing season. Lord Amory de St. Vincent, now in his early 40s, sat at the long oak table, rubbing his fingers across the wood grain. His son Jean had recently returned from Poitiers, where he had begun his training in estate law and the customs of the nobility. Amory's beard had turned silver at the edges. His shoulders no longer carried armor, only the weight of years. Isabeau, his wife of nearly 2 decades, had moved her chambers closer to the family chapel. She still managed the household accounts, her handwriting still crisp, her fingers still firm. But she no longer attended court banquets. She prayed longer, ate less, and smiled rarely. Their marriage endured, but not because it thrived. Rather, it persisted like an old stone wall, worn, reliable, and burdened by the duty of holding everything else together. Jean's coming of age. By his 15th year, Jean had outgrown the narrow halls of the St. Vincent Keep. He had learned his letters, Latin psalms, and the art of seal-making from a notary. He had hunted wild boar, learned how to ride with a firm seat, and once spent a season as a page in the household of Count Guilhem of Angoulême. He was not brilliant, but he was competent sufficient, perhaps, to carry the line forward. His parents began discussions of his marriage. In keeping with noble practice, the objective was not affection or companionship, but the consolidation of security. A younger daughter of the de Lenson family was proposed, Elisande, aged 13, known for her skill with embroidery and her father's extensive wool holdings. The negotiations were formal. Her dowry would include a parcel of land near New York, 600 silver livres, 2 wagons and a breeding mare. In return, Jean would inherit St. Vincent and maintain a permanent vassal contract, with the D'Alençon lords extending their influence toward the western forests. Amory watched it unfold with a mix of satisfaction and weariness. He had once stood in Jean's place. He remembered the same rituals, the same heavy garments, the same indifferent promises. He said little, but oversaw every detail with precision. Isabeau, though invited to participate, declined to travel for the wedding. She sent with her son a carved ivory comb and a book of Marian devotions. The legalization of continuity. With Jean's marriage formalized and a male heir likely to follow, Amory began to formalize the succession. He summoned a notary from Limoges to draft a series of charters, one confirming Jean as sole heir to the St. Vincent estates, one granting Isabeau lifetime residence in the eastern wing of the keep, one affirming tithes to 3 local churches for the family's souls. These documents formed the legal skeleton of a noble house. Without them, cousins might challenge inheritance, widows might be displaced, daughters might lose dower rights. It was, in the eyes of the church and the crown, the responsible way to die. Amory, though still strong of body, had begun to prepare. Decline and stagnation. While the family line held firm, the estate itself began to decline. The fields near the marshland had grown less fertile. Trade routes had shifted east, away from the small market town that once enriched the St. Vincents. The wool trade, once reliable, had slowed due to unrest in the Low Countries. More troubling still were the bandits' dispossessed soldiers from the Albigensian Crusade, now roaming as mercenaries and raiders. Amory's constables reported a sharp increase in grain thefts and unauthorized tolls taken on forest roads. The estate lacked the funds to raise more men-at-arms. Taxes had already pressed the peasants. Tenants were leaving. Some sought work in the freer towns. Others joined religious movements that promised liberation from both lord and bishop. Amory found himself issuing more edicts than ever, restricting foraging in certain woods, levying grain in kind instead of coin, sending letters to the bishop begging for stronger enforcement against vagrants. He was becoming what he once feared, a minor noble clinging to formality as the ground slipped beneath him. Isabeau's final years. Isabeau aged into dignified silence. Her hair, once thick and dark, now silvered beneath a veil. She wore widow's black, though her husband still lived. Her days were ordered, prayers at dawn, letters after breakfast, herbal remedies in the afternoon, and psalms before bed. She spoke little, but she still knew everything that occurred within the estate walls. A misplaced candle, a pregnant maid, a steward's missing ledger, she saw it all. Occasionally, she would sit with her grandson Jean's firstborn and teach him Latin letters using a wax tablet. He listened quietly, and she traced his name with a tremor in her hand. Her final illness came in winter, without drama. A cough turned into breathlessness. She refused to be moved. The priest visited daily. She received the Eucharist, dictated a short letter to her sister, and instructed that she be buried with the psalter she had commissioned years earlier. When she died, the bell rang 6 times. The entire household paused. Even the dogs seemed to sense the absence. Amory did not weep, but he did not speak for 3 days. The burial and the epitaph. Isabeau was buried beneath the chapel floor, alongside her daughter Marie. A stone slab was placed above her, etched with simple Latin. Hic iacit Isabia, Domina de Sancto Vincent. Obiit anno Domini MCCLXI. Orate pro anima ius. Here lies Isabeau, Lady of St. Vincent. She died in the year of our Lord 1261. Pray for her soul. There was no mention of her dowry, no list of children, no words of love or suffering, just the facts of her passing and a plea for prayers. But within the house, her legacy endured in the records she kept, the habits she formed, the generations she steadied. Amory's final years. Amory survived her by 4 winters. He grew thin and ill-tempered. His steward noted his increasing forgetfulness, his tendency to repeat himself. He sometimes confused his grandson with Jean. On feast days, he dressed in his old armor, though it no longer fit. When he died, Jean arranged a mass of the dead attended by neighboring lords. The Bishop of Poitiers sent a letter of condolence. A chronicler in the Abbey of Fontevraud recorded his death as a marginal note. His tomb stood beside Isabeau's. Their names, side by side, outlasted their voices. The quiet impact of a marriage fulfilled. The marriage of Amory and Isabeau de Saint Vincent did what it was designed to do. It produced an heir. It secured disputed lands. It stabilized a feudal region for a generation. It preserved the line, however modestly. No battles were fought for love. No verses were written in their names. But in the annals of baronial France, they were exactly what they were supposed to be: a bond of function, legality, and guarded endurance. And in a time when many noble houses collapsed under the weight of ambition, their quiet unity was, perhaps, a kind of success. What did it mean to be remembered? Jean ruled quietly until the plague. His son survived it and married a daughter of the House of Blois. The Saint Vincent name eventually disappeared, absorbed by larger families. But the documents remain charters, wills, dowry records, fragments of a life lived carefully. Isabeau's psalter resurfaced in a Parisian antiquarian's collection in the 19th century. The comb Amory gave her was buried with her and remains lost to time. Yet their story survives in the margins of legal parchments and the steady hand of a widow who balanced account books in silence. Their marriage was not legendary, but it was lasting. In a world where power often screamed through war and bloodlines, they whispered through parchment and patience. Was that not in its own way a legacy? Story 3. Nuns who became mothers. The cold morning mist clung to the stone walls of the Abbey of Saint Croix in the Loire Valley. Beyond the cloister's covered walkways, the garden lay still, save for the occasional rustle of a novice turning soil with a wooden spade. Inside the chapter house, under painted wooden beams and the watchful eyes of saints carved in oak, the sisters read aloud the rule of Saint Benedict. Among them sat Sister Agnes, 42 years old, professed nearly 3 decades earlier, and secretly pregnant. The story of women like Agnes nuns who became mothers is one that lies at the very edges of medieval historical records, preserved only in fragments of inquisitorial trials, bishopric registers, and the marginal notes of monks appalled by the scandal. Yet these stories are real, and they tell us not only about broken vows, but about human need, survival, coercion, and the fragile lines between the sacred and the secular in the medieval world. The cloistered life, an ideal. In theory, medieval convents were closed world's places of prayer, silence, chastity, and enclosure. A nun took solemn vows of poverty, obedience, and chastity, surrendering her body and will to God. The cloister wall symbolized a boundary between the spiritual and the worldly, between heavenly order and earthly temptation. The rule of Saint Benedict, widely adopted across Western Europe, governed daily life. 7 canonical hours of prayer. Manual labor, particularly in gardens or scriptoria. Silence during meals. Complete separation from men. But this ideal was imperfect in practice, especially in smaller convents or rural abbeys that lacked strong oversight. Abbeys were not self-sufficient. They relied on outside workers, male carpenters, shepherds, scribes, and even priests who celebrated Mass or heard confession. Some women entered willingly. Others were placed there as children with no intention of remaining. And some, like Sister Agnes, carried secrets under their habits. How a nun came to take vows. Agnes had not chosen the veil. She was the third daughter of a minor knight in the region of Anjou. Her elder sister was married off at 15. Her younger brother was being trained for the church. Agnes, at the age of 8, was brought to the gates of Saint Croix and left in the care of the prioress. This was common practice in the 12th and 13th centuries. Noble and aspiring merchant families often placed daughters in convents as a form of spiritual investment or economic necessity. Dowries for nuns were far cheaper than those for brides. Girls raised in the convent from childhood became oblates dedicated to God by their families. By 14 or 15, they took vows sometimes under pressure, sometimes with resignation. Agnes professed hers before the bishop and took the name Sister Agnes of the Cross. Her dowry included a psalter, 2 silver spoons, and a parcel of farmland donated to the abbey by her uncle. For 20 years, she lived the cloistered life without controversy. Routine and discontent. Life inside Saint Croix followed the rhythms of the liturgical calendar. Days were marked by bells, fasts, chants, and chores. The nuns tended gardens, baked bread, illuminated manuscripts, and occasionally provided herbs and healing for the surrounding villages. But under the surface of this sacred order lay tension. The abbey's resources were thin. Repairs to the cloister roof had been delayed for years. The cellarer reported missing grain. A younger novice had recently fled and was rumored to be living with a soldier near Tours. The bishop's visits were infrequent and formal. Among the sisters, discontent simmered. Some longed for contact with family. Others resented the strict punishments for minor rule infractions. The presence of male workers, ostlers, carpenters, confessors created opportunities for clandestine relationships. Sister Agnes, a respected herbalist within the community, had been assigned to treat one such carpenter, a man in his 20s, with a wounded hand and a quiet demeanor. His name was Pierre. Their conversations began over poultices. They extended to questions about life beyond the cloister. They ended in a secret relationship. Love, power, or survival. It is impossible to know whether Agnes and Pierre's relationship was one of love, coercion, or a mix of both. The historical record rarely tells us. We do know that women in cloisters were uniquely vulnerable. Though vowed, they remained women with physical needs and desires, but also lived under strict control, lacking free movement, privacy, or even the ability to leave without formal ecclesiastical permission. Some nuns engaged in secret relationships out of genuine affection. Others were coerced by visiting clergy or workers. Some used sexuality as a form of resistance or bargaining. Others simply yearned for the experience of motherhood, even at great cost. For Agnes, the consequences of that choice or that moment of vulnerability would unfold slowly. Her robes began to fit differently. She adjusted her belt more often. She complained of nausea. One sister, suspicious, whispered her concerns to the abbess. Church discipline and hidden pregnancies. When a pregnancy was suspected, procedure dictated a canonical inquiry. The bishop was informed. A panel of clerics might be appointed. Witnesses were called. In some cases, the woman was examined by midwives. Denial was common. Confession was sometimes coerced. Historical records across France, Italy, and England reveal such cases. A nun near Marseille who gave birth in the infirmary and was banished. A Flemish prioress accused of multiple affairs, defended by her sisters. A sister near Milan whose child was raised secretly in a nearby village. Punishment varied. Some were defrocked, returned to secular life, stripped of their veil. Others were sent to stricter convents. In rare cases, the child was killed at birth intentionally or through neglect. Agnes gave birth in secret one stormy night in the convent's storage room, with only one loyal sister present. The baby, a girl, lived. Her cries echoed off the stone walls. By morning, the abbess knew what to do with the child. Agnes begged to keep the infant. She offered to live in seclusion, to surrender her privileges, to serve in silence. But the abbess could not risk scandal. The bishop had been notified. The sisters were frightened. The carpenter had disappeared. A child born in a convent was proof of failure, spiritual, institutional, and communal. But it was also a human life. Ultimately, the abbess arranged for the infant to be given to a wet nurse in a nearby village. The child was baptized Claire and listed as Filiola Ignota, an unknown daughter. No father was named. Agnes was forbidden from visiting her. The bishop arrived 2 weeks later. What could be done with the mother? Bishop Bertrand of Tours was a pragmatic man. He had seen worse. He interviewed Agnes personally, recorded her confession, and consulted the canonists in Poitiers. The verdict: Agnes would not be expelled. She would be assigned lifelong penance, including fasting, seclusion during festivals, and silence during mealtimes. She would never again serve as herbalist. Her name would be recorded in the bishop's register with a notation: Vota violata, misericordia data, vows broken, mercy given. This decision reflected a broader pastoral shift in 13th century church policy, away from automatic punishment and toward correction, especially if the woman showed contrition. But within the convent, her life was never the same. Some sisters avoided her, others pitied her. A few, in quiet acts of defiance, left herbs or bread near her chamber door. Agnes endured. As she sat one evening years later, watching swallows dart across the cloister garden, she wondered quietly: was her daughter safe? Was she happy? Would she ever know where she came from or who had loved her, even from behind stone walls in silence? The years passed at St. Croix Abbey with measured rhythm: bells, psalms, frost, thaw. Sister Agnes, though no longer permitted to teach or tend the infirmary, remained in the cloister. Her role diminished, her presence softened. She became one of those quiet figures whom novices feared and pitied in equal measure, an enduring cautionary tale wrapped in a veil. But outside the abbey walls, her daughter Claire was growing up. This section of the story shifts focus beyond the cloister, to the uneasy world where children born of broken vows were raised in secrecy, silence, or shame. It is a world where church law, village gossip, and survival strategies collided, often leaving mothers and children on the margins of both the religious and the familial. Claire, daughter of no one. Claire had no surname, no known father, and no recognized place in the social order. She had been taken in by a local woman named Alpides, a widow with 2 sons who worked part-time as a wet nurse for local convents and manors. In exchange for a small annual stipend from the abbey, Alpides agreed to raise Claire as her own, though she never formally adopted her. This arrangement was typical of ecclesiastical compromise: discreet, practical, and unofficial. Claire grew up knowing that her mother was a sister in the abbey, but no name was spoken aloud. By the age of 5, she had learned not to ask questions. She spent her days gathering herbs, sweeping floors, and watching Alpides prepare poultices. When she was old enough to carry water without spilling it, she was sent to help in the kitchens of a nearby priory. She was clever, she listened well, and she learned early that to be quiet was to be safe. The village knows more than it says. In a medieval village, secrets rarely remained so. Though no one confronted Claire directly, whispers followed her. She was known as La Petite de l'Abbé, the little one from the abbey. Some said her mother had been seduced by a visiting knight. Others claimed she was the daughter of a priest. A few believed she was a changeling, a fairy child left in the convent by a desperate woman. Claire grew up under these murmurs, learning to move around them. Her lack of surname meant she could not marry easily. Her ambiguous status meant she could not join a convent nor inherit property. She was neither peasant nor noble, neither clerical nor free. And yet many children like her existed. They were hidden children of clergy, illicit offspring of monks or friars, infants quietly passed into the care of wet nurses or monasteries. They existed in legal limbo, tolerated but unclaimed. Canon law and the illegitimate. Church law in the 13th century treated illegitimacy as a serious but not insurmountable impediment. Children born out of wedlock, especially from those who had taken vows, could not inherit lands, enter certain clerical offices, or make claims of kinship unless legitimated by the Pope or a bishop. However, the Church increasingly distinguished between sin and status. A child could be innocent, even if the act that produced them was not. Pope Innocent III, writing decades earlier, had insisted that the sins of the parents did not condemn the child. Still, social realities often proved less merciful. Claire, like many in her position, lived under the shadow of her undefined origin. She was not shunned outright, but doors remained closed, and the quiet, questioning glances never ceased. Sister Agnes, penitent but not powerless. Within the walls of St. Croix, Sister Agnes lived her penance with quiet resolve. Her duties were limited to cleaning, prayer, and silent contemplation. She no longer sat among the choir during services. She wore a gray scapular instead of the usual black. She spoke only when spoken to. But in her silence she watched, and in watching she adapted. Over time, Agnes became an informal advisor to the abbess, not in public, but behind closed doors. Her knowledge of herbs, memory of estate accounts, and understanding of local families remained unmatched. When a novice fell ill, it was Agnes who mixed the elixirs. When a bishop visited, it was Agnes who remembered which wine he preferred. She was quietly indispensable. And she never asked to see her daughter. But once a year, on the feast of St. Anne, she stood at the cloister's edge and looked toward the village road where a girl with auburn hair sometimes passed with a basket of bread. Encounters in passing. By her 16th year, Claire had become a kitchen servant for the nearby Cistercian priory. One winter's afternoon, she was sent to the abbey with dried herbs and salt. At the gate, she met a nun with worn hands and gray robes who paused, looked at her, and said simply, "You stand like your mother did." Claire froze. The words were not cruel. They were not kind. They were a key in a lock she did not know she carried. She nodded, gave her basket to the porter, and left. But from that day forward, she began to wonder more deeply. Who was her mother, really? Was she alive? Was she penitent? Did she regret what she had done? She would not learn the answers, not then. The bishop returns. In 1294, Bishop Guillaume's successor to the long-deceased Bertrand arrived at St. Croix on a visitation tour. These episcopal visitations were formal inspections meant to ensure compliance with canon law. They involved reviewing financial records, interviewing sisters under oath, inspecting the dormitories and kitchens, listening to confessions. Sister Agnes, now nearly 60, was called to testify. She spoke with humility, acknowledged her past, and reaffirmed her continued repentance. The bishop, impressed by her demeanor and the abbess's testimony, lifted part of her penance. She was allowed to rejoin communal meals. Her silence requirement was relaxed. Her name was struck from the disciplinary column in the abbey register. In the margins, the scribe noted, "Conversio fidelis, soror antiquissima, meriter misericordiam." A faithful return, the oldest sister, she deserves mercy. Legacy in the living. Though they never embraced and never spoke more than a handful of words, Claire and Agnes remained bound not by law, not by custom, but by a silent recognition. Claire eventually left the village and entered the service of a noble household as a handmaid. She never married. She lived long enough to see the early tremors of the Avignon papacy. Agnes died at age 74, quietly in her cell. Her final prayer was whispered at matins. She was buried in the abbey graveyard without fanfare, her stone marked only with Agnes' sister, Mother Penitent. It was unusual for such an inscription to mention motherhood, but someone, perhaps the abbess, perhaps the scribe, had chosen to honor all her roles. Was redemption ever complete? The church offered redemption through penance. Society offered silence through shame. But Agnes lived between those poles, never fully punished, never fully restored. Her daughter lived in the world she could not re-enter, and through Claire's quiet endurance, her own legacy continued, not through lineage, but through resilience. In the stillness of the cloister garden, where the lavender once grew, one might ask, what becomes of a vow when it breaks, if it was never freely chosen in the first place? The story of Sister Agnes, her fall, her endurance, and her quiet death was never told in full within the Abbey of Sainte Croix. Her name became a whisper among novices, a half-remembered caution against temptation. Yet her story was not unique. Across medieval Europe, there were many women like her, nuns who bore children, repented, lived in shame or silence, and died without official recognition. These women existed in the margins of both the church and history. Their experiences, long hidden in ecclesiastical records, offer a window into the complex humanity behind monastic walls, a world that aspired to perfection but in practice was shaped by frailty, longing, and endurance. This final section broadens the lens, tracing the wider history of nuns who became mothers, how the church responded to their transgressions, and what these lives meant in the greater narrative of marriage, motherhood, and monasticism in the Middle Ages. The church's dilemma, ideal versus reality. The church viewed female chastity as a pillar of the monastic ideal. The purity of a cloistered woman was not only spiritual but symbolic, representing the untouched sanctity of the church itself. When a nun bore a child, it was more than a personal failing, it was a theological scandal. And yet these violations happened more than once. Church records from the 12th to 14th centuries reveal nuns expelled from convents for carnal sin, entire communities placed under investigation after multiple pregnancies, bishops torn between applying punishment and offering redemption. Punishment varied with context, exclusion from choir or common table, lifelong penance under strict confinement, defrocking, especially in cases of repeated offenses. In rare cases, reinstatement, particularly if the nun showed long-term repentance. In many cases, the church struggled to balance justice and mercy. Bishops recognized that some women had entered convents under duress or been assaulted by confessors or workers. Others had formed secret attachments over years of isolation and emotional deprivation. The doctrine was clear, the practice far murkier. Examples from the records. Sister Agnes's story parallels others across Europe. A few of these cases survive in documents preserved in episcopal archives. 1. Sister Margarita of Arezzo, c. 1268. A nun who gave birth in a Benedictine convent. Her child was left at the convent gate and taken in by a midwife. She was publicly defrocked and placed in a rural priory. Years later, her name reappeared in a list of convent librarians. 2. The Convent of Saint-Germain, Flanders, c. 1320. 3 sisters were found to be pregnant within 2 years. A visitation report accused local clergy of moral negligence. The bishop ordered the abbess removed and installed a reform-minded replacement. One of the women was later reinstated after testifying against the priest. 3. Sister Beatrice of Lyon, c. 1245. She gave birth to a son whose father was never named. The boy became a servant in a nearby monastery. Beatrice was confined for 10 years and later wrote devotional poetry still preserved in manuscript form. Her work contains cryptic references to childbirth and divine mercy. These women were not heretics. They did not reject the church. They stumbled, and many remained within the fold, repenting, working, and witnessing. Spiritual motherhood and biological reality. Ironically, while the church condemned physical motherhood within cloisters, it celebrated spiritual motherhood. Nuns were often referred to as brides of Christ. Abbesses were called mothers. Older sisters mentored younger ones in the spiritual life, and some convents raised foundlings, abandoned children taken in by the community, and raised as servants or oblate children. This created an uneasy paradox. Nuns could care for children but not have them. They could nourish lives but not create them. And yet, the human body obeyed no such boundaries. Women's religious orders also functioned as hospitals, schools, and homes for unwanted girls. In these roles, they encountered daily reminders of motherhood, childbirth, and domestic life. When a nun like Agnes gave birth, it was not always an act of rebellion. Sometimes it was an accidental blurring of the very roles the church had encouraged them to embody: caregivers, healers, mothers in all but name. The community response. Within convent walls, reactions to pregnant nuns varied. Some sisters reacted with scandal and fear, worried about divine punishment or episcopal censure. Others showed compassion. Some even aided in the secrecy. Convent chronicles sometimes record the internal tension. Sister Juliana did weep bitterly, yet none dared console her. The prioress gave silence but left bread near her cell. She is not lost, only wounded. In these moments, we glimpse a community navigating its own broken ideals. And often, as in the case of Agnes, the response was shaped less by outrage and more by quiet negotiation, a recognition that human failure need not destroy spiritual life. What became of the children? Children born in convents rarely stayed. Some were sent to foundling hospitals. Others were raised by villagers or distant relatives. A few entered religious life themselves, though canon law typically barred illegitimate children from entering the clergy without a papal dispensation. Some mothers managed, subtly, to watch over their children's lives. Others never knew what became of them. There is little trace of Clare after her time as a handmaid. Like many medieval women, she vanished into the records, her life unremarkable by the standards of chroniclers, but perhaps meaningful in its own quiet way. We do know that she outlived her mother, and we know she kept the comb Agnes had once given her carved with a small cross and initials she never understood. The fate of the fallen nun. Sister Agnes died as she had lived, in partial silence, but her life, now reconstructed through narrative, reminds us that the cloister was not always as sealed as it seemed. She was a nun, she was a mother, she was a rule breaker and a rule follower. She endured scorn and earned respect. She repented and continued to serve. She was, in short, a human being, constrained by the rigid forms of medieval religious life, but never entirely reduced by them. What remains? The stories of nuns who became mothers did not change church doctrine. They did not spark revolution, but they quietly shifted perceptions, forcing bishops, abbesses, and sisters to confront the limits of control and the persistence of humanity. They left behind traces: ink-stained parchments in episcopal archives, notes in visitation records, psalters written in unsteady hands, children who grew into adults with missing names and lingering questions. And they left behind legacies unofficial, unsanctioned but real. Where do we find these women in history? Not in the saints' calendars, not in stained glass windows, but in the hesitation of a scribe recording a penance, the whisper of a novice about a woman who used to sing, the empty space in a family tree where a name might have been. They are found in the silences of history, not its proclamations. In the quiet, enclosed spaces of the medieval convent, where prayers echoed and vows were whispered, a question remained suspended in the still air. When a woman breaks a vow not out of rebellion, but out of need or longing, is her failure a sin or a mirror held up to the limits of the world she was born into? Story 4. The Silent Wife, Marital Obedience in Anglo-Norman England. The air in the manor hall of Walderton was thick with the scent of peat smoke and damp wool. It was the year 1149. England was a kingdom torn by civil war between Empress Matilda and King Stephen in a period known to chroniclers as the Anarchy. But for Lady Edith of Walderton, political chaos barely disturbed her world. Her battlefield was smaller, quieter, and closer to home. It was her marriage. She was 23 years old, the wife of a minor Anglo-Norman knight, Sir Osbert de Wintone. Her marriage, like many among the lesser gentry in 12th century England, had been arranged to settle a debt and seal a border alliance between two petty landowners. She brought with her a modest dowry of linen, sheep, and a half-share in a pasture near Chichester. Her obedience was assumed. What followed was not a life of violence, nor one of romance, but something more common, and in many ways more oppressive: the daily erosion of self, lived beneath the weight of marital obedience. The framework of marital law. In the eyes of the Church, marriage was a sacrament. In the eyes of the Anglo-Norman legal world, it was also a contract. That contract was simple. The husband offered protection and provision. The wife offered obedience and fidelity. While canon law insisted on mutual consent, once the vows were exchanged and consummated, the husband's authority became paramount. Legal manuals like the Lex Henrici Primi, compiled earlier in the century, reflected a hierarchy wherein women were treated as dependents first of their fathers, then of their husbands. A wife could not leave her husband without ecclesiastical permission, control property independently, except under rare dower exceptions, refuse her husband sexually, except during periods of penance or pregnancy, testify against her husband in most courts. Obedience was not just moral, it was legal infrastructure. Daily life in obedience. Lady Edith's world was made of routines. Rise before dawn to oversee bread baking. Distribute tasks to household servants. Mend garments, manage stores, and plan feast days. Sit in silence while her husband held court over villeins and freemen. Her voice was rarely raised above a murmur. Sir Osbert was not cruel. He was simply unmoved by her opinions. She had once asked to reintroduce barley cakes into the household larder, a food her mother had prepared during lean winters. He dismissed it as a peasant's taste. She never brought it up again. She learned to avoid correction by avoiding initiative. Silence became her armor. Confession and conscience. The only space where Edith could speak freely was the confessional, a wooden stall in the side chapel where the village priest, Father Alfric, received her whispered thoughts once each week. There she confessed. Disobedient thoughts when Sir Osbert ignored her. Envy of her unmarried sister who had taken vows and joined a convent. Occasional dreams of her childhood home. Father Alfric reminded her that obedience was a virtue, that the Virgin Mary had submitted, that her suffering, borne in silence, would win her grace. Edith nodded. She repeated the prayers, but something in her remained unconvinced. Property, control, and the edges of independence. Although Sir Osbert controlled the manor, Edith had been granted a dower portion, a legal right to a third of her husband's land if she survived him. In practice, this land was not hers to manage during his lifetime, but it offered the illusion of security. She managed small economies within the household. She instructed the dairymaids, oversaw the planting of herbs in the kitchen garden, paid alms to the poor in flour and ale. Yet each coin spent required his approval. Once, when she gave 2 silver pennies to a passing pilgrim without consulting him, She was rebuked not with violence, but with 3 days of coldness and silence. It was then she realized obedience was not about punishment, it was about absence. A letter never sent. One spring, Edith secretly wrote a letter to her childhood friend Alice, now living in a convent outside Winchester. She wrote, "I long for a place where silence is shared, not imposed, where questions are not shameful. Here, my thoughts have no weight unless they echo his." She never sent the letter. It remained folded in a pouch, hidden among her embroidery threads. This was not rebellion. It was a small attempt at remembering herself. Reading as resistance. Among the few privileges Edith enjoyed was access to the household's tiny collection of books kept under lock in the solar. These included a Psalter in Latin, a copy of Boethius, Consolation of Philosophy, a hagiography of St. Margaret, and a tattered romance, Tristan and Isolde, hidden behind the rest. At night she read by candlelight. The saints' stories gave her patience. Boethius gave her perspective. But it was the romance sensuous, tragic, ill-advised that stirred something deeper. She didn't desire the betrayal or even the passion, but she envied the voice. Isolde spoke, she wept, she defied, she acted. Edith closed the book and whispered into the dark, "Would I ever be forgiven for simply speaking aloud?" The unseen rebellion of wives. Historians of the medieval world often miss women like Edith because they left few records. Yet court rolls and ecclesiastical registers offer glimpses. Records from English manorial courts in the 12th century show women fined for contradicting their husbands in public, wives accused of idle gossip or unjustified pouting, a handful of complaints from men that their wives had acted without license. In a society where marital disobedience was not a criminal offense, but a moral failing, control was enforced through shame, isolation, and dismissal, not chains or dungeons. Edith never disobeyed in any visible way, but her inner life was full of small withholdings. She delayed messages. She held back compliments. She did not kneel quite as low during prayers beside her husband. These were the tiny seams in the robe of obedience, the shape of a life unspoken. By her early 30s, Edith had borne 3 children, 2 daughters who died in infancy, and 1 son who lived. Her body had changed, her pace had slowed, her eyes were sharp though she spoke even less. She had learned the precise amount of voice to use in any given hour. And yet, in her silence, she had cultivated a mind that was never truly conquered. She still read. She still wrote, though no one read her words. She still remembered the girl she had been before obedience was her daily bread. As she sat one evening watching her son learn his Latin verbs, she wondered not with regret, but with a quiet ache. If I had spoken more, would I have been less loved or more real? The year was 1158, nearly a decade into Lady Edith's marriage. England had shifted slightly. King Stephen was dead, and Henry II now ruled, seeking to restore royal authority over a fractured realm. But in the manor of Walderton, nestled quietly in the Sussex countryside, the outside world remained a distant echo. Within the timber and stone manor house, Edith's days were as ordered as the liturgical calendar. Her son, Simon, now 7, studied his Latin and Psalms with a tutor hired from the local priory. Her husband, Sir Osbert, spent increasing time managing their livestock holdings and attending quarterly courts held by the sheriff. Edith, as always, remained at the periphery, ever present, rarely central. Her life had grown quieter, even as her understanding of her place, both confined and essential, had grown clearer. A life of threads. The hearth was where Edith worked best. She had taken over responsibility for the household's linen production, organizing the women who spun and wove, tracking the stores of flax and wool, mending the garments of every person in the house, from serfs to steward. She had developed her own embroidery patterns, subtle vines, and geometric knots which, though humble, became known in the surrounding manors. She would never have admitted pride in it aloud, but her hands told the story. Thread by thread, she stitched meaning into days that otherwise passed unrecorded. Edith's quiet library. Edith had petitioned her husband to let her borrow books from the priory. At first, he had refused, saying it was unnecessary for a wife. But eventually, with the prior's intervention, she was allowed 2 books at a time, so long as she kept them locked in the chest beside her bed. She read a copy of Augustine's Confessions, though the Latin proved difficult. She preferred homiletic text collections of sermons written in Anglo-Norman French, and she still returned to the life of Saint Margaret, with its account of suffering endured in silence. Saint Margaret had submitted to torment at the hands of a pagan ruler, praying through every lash. Edith did not think herself a saint, but she saw in Margaret something she recognized: the sacramental dignity of quiet endurance. Legal doctrine, real marriage. In this period of reform and consolidation under Henry II, the legal landscape began to change. The king's justiciars traveled the country, implementing common law that increasingly touched rural estates like Walderton. This new system intersected with canon law, especially in matters of marriage, property, and widowhood. One significant development was the formal recognition of a woman's right to dower 1/3 of her husband's land, guaranteed upon his death. Edith had memorized the clause from a sermon she had once heard. Let no man deprive a widow of her share, which God and King have confirmed. It was one of the few protections. She had an invisible shield for a future she quietly imagined. Intimacy and its absence. Sir Osbert was not violent. He was not affectionate. Their relationship was one of dutiful routines, not shared intimacy. They shared a bed in the cold months, more for warmth than desire. In spring and summer he slept in the solar. Their conjugal relations, while never forced, were mechanical, brief, and wordless. Edith did not hate him, she simply did not know him. She once asked him timidly why he never asked about her thoughts. He replied, almost absently, "What use have I for thoughts about baking and bandages?" She did not ask again. Women in the shadows of the law. One day, the reeve of the manor brought news of a case from a neighboring estate. A woman named Hawise, wife of a yeoman, had appealed to the sheriff's court, claiming that her husband had abandoned her and taken another woman. The court ruled in Hawise's favor. Her husband was fined and ordered to return. The story circulated in whispers, and Edith overheard the kitchen servant mutter, "Would Lady Edith ever speak so in court?" The others laughed softly. They knew she would not. But in that moment, Edith wondered, if the law allowed a woman to protest abandonment, could it also permit her to protest being unseen? She did not know the answer. Feast days and the role of hostess. On St. Martin's Day, the manor held its customary feast. Edith oversaw the preparations. Spiced wine from Bordeaux, boiled mutton with leeks, roasted chestnuts, and trenchers of rye bread for the serfs. She greeted the visiting reeves and merchants with grace. She sat at her husband's right hand during the meal, saying little but nodding at the appropriate moments. After the feast, as the guests danced to the sound of pipe and drum, she excused herself and went to the chapel. There she knelt before the altar and whispered not prayers, exactly, but thoughts. "Let me be heard, if only by you," she said aloud to no one. "An air grows, and so do questions." Young Simon, her son, grew tall and curious. He began asking questions about his mother's life before marriage. "What was your favorite place in your father's hall? Did you ride horses as a girl? Why did you marry father?" To these she offered careful answers. She praised her father's garden. She described riding a pony once. And to the third question she simply said, "Because I was asked." But she kept a journal now hidden in a box. its pages filled with small script. I do not write to be read. I write to exist, to hear myself when no one else does. What does obedience create? By her mid-30s, Edith's obedience had become reflexive. She did not have to be told to step back when men entered a room. She knew how to bow without seeming servile. She smiled when praised, even when it stung. But she had also become shrewd. She negotiated with tenants indirectly, using trusted servants. She arranged for her son's tutor to include moral instruction in Anglo-Norman, which Osbert never questioned. She built quiet relationships with local women, trading salves and stories beneath the guise of hospitality. She had become, in her own way, a manager of lives, just not her own. One night, as she watched the moonlight spill across the stone floor of the chapel, she whispered, "If I am not permitted to rule, may I at least endure in such a way that I am not erased." The wind rolled down from the South Downs, whispering across the thatched roofs and sheep-dotted fields of the Walderton Manor. It had been nearly 20 years since Lady Edith had been wed to Sir Osbert de Wintone. She was now past 40, her son Simon nearly of age, and the world around her slowly transforming, though in ways that seemed more structural than personal. England was more stable under King Henry II, and his legal reforms had reached deep into local society. Yet for women like Edith, who lived within the confines of marital obedience and feudal expectation, personal change remained subtle, internal, and largely invisible to the record. What follows is the close of Edith's story, not with rebellion, not with dramatic upheaval, but with a reflection on how obedience, endurance, and quiet resistance shaped not only her life, but the lives of women after her. An heir in waiting. Simon, now 18, was preparing to take on increasing responsibility for the estate. He had traveled once to Winchester with his father, attended legal sessions, and begun issuing orders to the reeve and steward. He was dutiful, courteous, and increasingly confident. Edith had taken care to shape her son's character not through sermons, but through suggestion. She encouraged his reading of saints' lives and Solomon's wisdom. She taught him restraint in speech, patience in observation. She often posed questions instead of giving commands. In Simon, she saw the possibility of a different kind of man, one who might one day see his wife not as an extension of household function, but as a thinking partner. She never said so aloud, but she prayed for it. The widow next door. In the neighboring manor of Bridgestone, a woman named Aveline had recently become a widow. Her husband, a knight of modest fortune, had died suddenly of fever. To Edith's surprise, Aveline had not remarried. She had instead claimed her dower lands and begun managing them herself. She wore no veil of mourning. She attended manorial court. She oversaw the planting of winter wheat. Rumors followed her, of course. Some said she had bewitched her husband. Others whispered of her negotiating directly with merchants in Chichester. Edith watched her from afar. She admired her not with envy, but with a kind of detached wonder. Could a woman, unbound, truly wield authority without being diminished? Would Aveline's independence be remembered or punished? Anticipating widow, Edith began quietly to prepare for the day she might outlive Osbert. Statistically, it was likely men often died first. She had no desire to remarry. She wished only for space. She began keeping 2 separate ledgers. One for the current management of the household. One for how she would run her dower lands, should the time come. She made note of which servants were loyal, which tenants paid on time, which fields were most fertile. She also began writing her own book of hours, copying favorite psalms in Anglo-Norman French, interspersing them with personal reflections. I have bent my neck, and yet my spine remembers how to stand. God, who sees what is hidden, knows that silence is not always consent. Blessed be the woman who learns to listen to herself. This was not a rebellion. It was a record, a whisper offered to the future. A new queen and a changing court. News arrived in 1164 that Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine had spoken in a legal dispute involving her lands. Edith listened closely to the account. Eleanor had not only advised Henry II, but had held court in Poitiers, ruling over petitions. Though such women were rare, they were not impossible. Powerful noblewomen had ruled in Normandy and Flanders. Matilda, Henry's mother, had once claimed the English crown. These were not women of Edith's station, but they existed, and their existence pressed gently on the edges of what women might imagine. Edith told Simon the story of Eleanor's judgment. He listened and said, "I would not mind a wife with thoughts like that so long as she shared them." She smiled. That was enough. The death of Sir Osbert. Sir Osbert died in the winter of 1166 after falling from a horse on a frozen road. His injuries were internal and swift. He confessed, took last rites, and asked Edith to keep the house as he had. She nodded. In the days that followed, she dressed in mourning gray, oversaw the funeral, and began the formal process of claiming her dower. By law, she was entitled to 1/3 of the arable lands, certain rights to income from the mill, use of a small manor house and garden, a modest annual share of the household goods. Simon, now of age, did not challenge her claim. He offered her full support and in private told her, "I learned from you more than from him." She did not cry, she simply exhaled. The widow's house. Edith moved into a small stone hall on the estate's edge. She brought her books, her spindle, and the journal she had kept since her youth. She hired a servant to manage the kitchen and took long walks among the pastures. She began receiving young women from nearby households, those preparing for marriage. Those recently wed, they came to her for advice, for herbal remedies, for silence. She never gave instructions, only questions. What do you wish to keep for yourself? What will you teach your son about listening? When do you feel most like yourself? She was not revered. She was not feared. She was simply known as the Lady of the Edge Hall, a woman who listened well and spoke with care. An unexpected petition. In her 60th year, Edith wrote to the priory at Winchester, requesting permission to donate her psalter and her Book of Hours to their scriptorium. In the letter she wrote, "Though my life was small in noise, it was large in thought. If God listens even when we do not speak, then may he hear these pages." The prior accepted. Her pages were copied, though her name was not preserved in the colophon. Still, the original survived tucked in a shelf with works by clergy and scribes. Her script was neat, though faded. What we remember and what we do. Edith's life was never recorded in chronicles. Her name does not appear in royal writs or court rolls, but she was one of thousands of women who lived within the strict frame of obedience and who made something within that frame. She shaped a child. She managed a house. She softened a husband's silence with her own careful presence. And when widowhood came, she stepped into a space not of command, but of calm stewardship. History forgets women like her because they left no scandal, no war, no innovation. But the linen she spun clothed children. The books she preserved carried prayers. The words she never spoke shaped the ears of a future son. Was obedience a kind of strength? In the end, Edith did not ask to be remembered, but in her journal's final page, written in a thin, trembling hand, she left a question. If a woman bows her head but keeps her thoughts intact, has she obeyed or simply endured with grace? Story 5. Child Brides in Political Games. The Case of Margaret Beaufort. The year was 1443, and England sat uneasily on the precipice of civil unrest. Though Henry VI still wore the crown, his weak rule and mental instability were beginning to fracture the realm. Noble families watched, plotted, and married with one eye on the throne and the other on survival. Into this world thick with ambition and dynastic anxiety was born Margaret Beaufort, a girl who would come to symbolize the brutal logic of marriage as politics, and the fate of countless noble girls in medieval England. To be married young, maneuvered often, and remembered rarely. Yet Margaret Beaufort would defy history's margins. She would become mother to a king, builder of institutions, and a quiet architect of Tudor power. But before all that, she was a child bride traded between men like a pawn on a noble chessboard. A child of royal blood. Margaret was born on May 31, 1443, at Bletsoe Castle in Bedfordshire. Her father, John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, was a great-grandson of King Edward III, though born of a legitimized line through John of Gaunt and his mistress turned wife, Catherine Swynford. Her Beaufort blood gave her proximity to royal power, but also placed her within a suspect lineage respected but never quite accepted. Her father died of illness or suicide shortly before or after her birth. Accounts differ. Her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, remarried, but Margaret's path was already being shaped by men far outside her household. At only a few months old, she became a valuable heiress. The Beaufort inheritance and its weight. Margaret's value was financial, territorial, and dynastic. She was heiress to vast lands and, more importantly, to a royal bloodline in a time when succession was everything. By age 1, the rights to her marriage had been granted to William de la Pole, 1st Duke of Suffolk, a major player in Henry VI's court. Suffolk had plans. His own son, John de la Pole, barely a child himself, was betrothed to the toddler Margaret. But this arrangement, like many in the era, was made not for love or even partnership, but to secure political alliances and consolidate wealth. These marriage contracts were legal instruments. The age of the parties was immaterial. What mattered was consent from guardians, royal approval, and the strategic outcome. Margaret's childhood was already wrapped in legal bonds she could not understand. Canon law and the consent paradox. The medieval church recognized 12 years as the legal age of consent for girls to marry and 14 for boys. But betrothals could occur far earlier, often in infancy. Canon law maintained that marriage required free consent, but that consent could be given by guardians, particularly in noble families where land and title were at stake. Thus, the church occupied a contradictory position. It advocated for mutual consent and protection of the sacrament, yet routinely blessed unions that were clearly coercive, especially for girls. Margaret Beaufort, like many of her rank, was married before she could read. Her first marriage a political ghost. At age 6 or 7, Margaret was formally married to John de la Pole, her initial betrothed. But this union was annulled just a few years later, with no consummation. It was likely a political maneuver. John's family had fallen out of favor at court, and Margaret's value as a bride had only increased. She was now a widow of a marriage that never truly was a strange status for a girl not yet 10. No records exist of her thoughts, only the paperwork remains. A pawn in a greater war. By the early 1450s, England was beginning to splinter. The dynastic conflict that would later be known as the Wars of the Roses was gaining momentum. The crown had no secure heir. Henry VI's mental illness had rendered him nearly catatonic, and his queen, Margaret of Anjou, was fiercely defending the rights of their infant son, Edward of Westminster. Enter the House of York, and with it, Richard, Duke of York, who claimed a stronger hereditary right to the throne. The nobility divided. Alliances became currency, and Margaret Beaufort, still just a girl, was once again offered as a prize. Marriage to the king's half-brother. In 1455, at age 12, Margaret was married again, this time to Edmund Tudor, half-brother to King Henry VI. Edmund was about 24 and a loyal Lancastrian. The marriage was politically motivated, designed to tie Margaret's Beaufort lineage to the king's maternal line through the Tudors' Welsh, upstarts recently legitimized. The union was a political investment for both families. But this time, the marriage was consummated. Consummation and consequences. In 15th century England, consummation of marriage before age 12 was discouraged by canon law, though not always enforced. Margaret was just 12 years old, and either pregnant or newly so when her husband, Edmund Tudor, died of plague in captivity during a skirmish of the Wars of the Roses. Now 13, Margaret was widowed, pregnant, and entirely alone. This moment would define her life not just for its trauma, but for the political implications of the child she carried. She was not yet a woman by legal standards, but the world now considered her one. Birth of a dynasty. In January 1457, Margaret gave birth to Henry Tudor, later King Henry VII, at Pembroke Castle in Wales. The birth was difficult and nearly fatal. Her body, still undeveloped, was not ready for childbirth. She would never bear another child. The experience marked her physically and emotionally. Many historians believe this shaped her later piety and political caution. She turned her energy not toward remarrying for desire or domestic comfort, but toward securing her son's future. Margaret, now 14, had entered the adult world through a door of pain and found power in its shadow. Stitched into history but never fully her own. What does Margaret's early life tell us about marriage in late medieval England? It reveals a world where noble girls were assets, not actors. Consent was legal fiction. Childhood ended not with age, but with utility. And motherhood could begin in a body not yet formed. Yet Margaret Beaufort's story also hints at something else, a mind awakening. Though she could not prevent her marriages, she would learn how to maneuver within their aftermath. Her later life funding universities, orchestrating Tudor propaganda, and managing estates was built upon the ruins of her childhood. She became formidable not by choice, but by necessity. As she watched her son take his first step still in hiding, still hunted, did she wonder, had her obedience saved him, or merely cost her herself? In the gray dawn of Pembroke Castle, Margaret Beaufort stood cloaked in mourning. She was 13 years old, newly widowed, and mother to a fragile infant boy. Her body was broken by childbirth. Her heart, already calloused by years of maneuver and loss, grew colder still. But Margaret was not a girl to be discarded or forgotten. The child she held in her arms, Henry Tudor, would one day seize the English crown, and Margaret, silent, calculating, and composed, would be the steady force behind him. Yet in 1457, that future was distant, shrouded in uncertainty. Before she became a matriarch of the Tudor dynasty, Margaret Beaufort had to survive the war-torn world of noble England, where every alliance was temporary, every friend a potential rival, and a woman's power only as strong as the man she stood beside or outlived. Life at Pembroke, under the Earl's eye. After Edmund Tudor's death, Margaret came under the wardship of Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother. Jasper was a loyal Lancastrian, and his stewardship of both Margaret and young Henry was strategic. He recognized Henry's royal potential, even if others did not. Jasper kept mother and child at Pembroke Castle, nestled in the Welsh countryside, safely removed from the growing conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York. He ensured they were protected, educated, and visible. But the protection came with limitations. Margaret had no control over her property. She required Jasper's permission for legal matters. She was expected to remarry, and quickly, for political gain. Even in widowhood, Margaret was a vessel for alliance. Forced marriage again, Sir Henry Stafford. At age 15, Margaret was married to Sir Henry Stafford, a younger son of the powerful Duke of Buckingham. The union was arranged without her consent, standard for noble widows, and confirmed by the Crown. Stafford was over 25, twice her age, but their marriage was markedly gentler than her previous one. There is some evidence that he treated Margaret with respect, even affection. They lived quietly at Woking Palace and other Stafford holdings, far from court intrigue. Margaret continued to dress modestly, observe daily prayers, and maintain her household with order and dignity. She became known for her deep piety, her caution in political speech, her watchful silence in social gatherings, and all the while she watched the kingdom unravel. The Wars of the Roses deepen. By the early 1460s, the dynastic feud between Lancaster and York had exploded into full civil war. In 1461, Edward of York defeated Henry VI's forces at the Battle of Towton and was crowned Edward IV. Henry VI, Margaret's former protector, was deposed. The Lancastrians, including Jasper Tudor, fled or went underground. Margaret and Stafford, being pragmatists, shifted their loyalty toward the Yorkist regime. It was not uncommon. Survival often required public allegiance to the victor, however temporary. Margaret sent respectful messages to Queen Elizabeth Woodville, wife of Edward IV. She maintained a low profile, hoping not to draw the wrath of the Yorkist court. But her son, Henry Tudor, descended from both the Lancastrian line and Beaufort blood, remained a threat. So long as he lived, Margaret's name could not be ignored. The fate of young Henry. In 1461, when Edward IV came to power, Henry Tudor was taken into custody by William Herbert, a Yorkist loyalist. Herbert hoped to neutralize the boy or marry him into a Yorkist family to diminish his claim. Margaret was powerless to prevent it. She was allowed occasional visits, always supervised, always limited. She watched her son raised by another family, shaped by another man's political motives. And yet she remained outwardly serene. She wrote letters, she gave gifts to Herbert's wife, she prayed. In private, she memorized every detail of court life, every shift in favor, every falling star. She was preparing the Stafford marriage and a turn in fortune. By 1470, Margaret's husband Henry Stafford fell ill and died, perhaps from wounds sustained at the Battle of Barnet. Their marriage had lasted over a decade, one of the few relatively stable periods in Margaret's life. She was now 27, twice widowed, still only mother to one child. Her fortunes shifted again when Henry VI was briefly restored to the throne during a rebellion by the Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker, and Queen Margaret of Anjou. For a few months in 1470-71, the Lancastrians controlled England again. Margaret rushed to court. She arranged an audience. She tried to secure a position for herself and her son. But the restoration was short-lived. In 1471, Edward IV returned, crushed the Lancastrians at Tewkesbury, and executed Henry VI's son. Shortly after, Henry VI was murdered in the Tower. The Lancastrian line was extinguished except for one boy, Henry Tudor. Fleeing to Brittany, the boy becomes a symbol. Realizing the danger, Jasper Tudor fled England with young Henry. They sailed to Brittany, where they were received by Duke Francis II. Margaret again could do nothing. Her only child was now in exile, living under the protection of a foreign duke. She did not know when or if she would see him again. She devoted herself to fasting, pilgrimage, and estate management, but behind the prayers was calculation. Margaret began laying the groundwork for something radical, the return of her son as claimant to the English throne. The making of a matriarch. Between 1472 and 1483, Margaret transitioned from pawn to political player. She arranged her third and final marriage to Thomas Stanley, Lord High Constable of England and a powerful nobleman under Edward IV. The marriage gave her access to court, influence in the north, a network of spies and informants, a shield of protection. Stanley, a political survivor, allowed her independence. They lived mostly apart, with Margaret managing her own estates and finances. She became a matron of influence, funding the education of clerics, supporting religious houses, and writing to foreign nobles on behalf of her son. She signed her name not as wife, but as Margaret R. Margaret Regina, not a queen in title but in ambition. The dream solidifies. In 1483, everything changed again. Edward IV died suddenly. His 12-year-old son, Edward V, was placed under the care of his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. By the end of the year, Richard had declared the boy illegitimate, taken the throne as Richard III, and imprisoned both Edward V and his brother in the Tower. They were never seen again. The princes in the Tower were presumed murdered. England, once again, was ready for a change. Margaret saw her moment. She opened secret negotiations with Elizabeth Woodville, Edward IV's widow. They forged an audacious plan. Henry Tudor would return from exile. He would marry Elizabeth of York, uniting Lancastrian and Yorkist claims. Together, they would restore order. All she needed was a chance. She stood before her household chapel and whispered, "I was born into bargain, but I will make one of my own." It is often said that the Tudor dynasty began on the blood-soaked field of Bosworth, but in truth, it began in the quiet chambers of Margaret Beaufort's household, long before swords were drawn. While men made war, Margaret made alliances. While kings ruled and fell, she endured, adapted, and waited. By 1483, her son Henry Tudor had been in exile for over a decade, a political exile with no army, little money, and no throne. Yet Margaret Beaufort, a woman with no official title, moved through the corridors of power, weaving a future from whispered loyalties and unsent letters. This final chapter is not just the story of Margaret's victory. It is the story of how one woman, married off as a child and widowed as a teen, became the strategic cornerstone of England's next royal house. The secret alliance, red and white. In the aftermath of Richard III's usurpation, England was divided. The deaths of the princes in the Tower had cast a shadow over Richard's legitimacy. The nobility stirred with unease. Old loyalties shifted. In 1483, Margaret Beaufort took a daring step. She brokered an alliance with Elizabeth Woodville, the mother of the presumed murdered princes. This alliance had three aims: to oppose Richard III's reign, to promote Henry Tudor's claim to the throne, and most crucially, to unite the houses of Lancaster and York through marriage. Henry would wed Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter. Their children would be heirs to both bloodlines, healing the rift that had torn England apart. This plan, devised in secrecy between two women of rival houses, would reshape English history. Rebellion and risk. In late 1483, an unsuccessful rebellion against Richard III, known as Buckingham's Rebellion, tried to capitalize on rising discontent. Margaret supported the revolt, offering funds and securing promises of support for Henry's landing from Brittany. But the rebellion failed. The Duke of Buckingham was executed, and Richard III grew suspicious of Margaret's involvement. She was accused of treason, and her estates were declared forfeit. Only the intervention of her husband, Lord Stanley, still loyal to Richard, spared her life. Margaret was placed under house arrest, her movements restricted, her letters monitored. But even in confinement, she maneuvered. She used servants and chaplains as messengers. She corresponded with exiles across the Channel. She maintained contact with Henry's allies in France and Wales. She bided her time, as she had done all her life. Bosworth, the long game ends. On August 7, 1485, Henry Tudor landed at Milford Haven with a modest army of French mercenaries and Welsh supporters. His aim was clear: to defeat Richard III and claim the crown. On August 22, 1485, at the Battle of Bosworth Field, Richard was killed in combat, his crown found on the battlefield and placed on Henry's head. Henry VII had triumphed. The Wars of the Roses were over. But in a very real sense, it was not Henry's victory alone. It was Margaret Beaufort's strategy, her alliances, her planning that made Bosworth possible. She had raised a king without a crown, from a body broken by childbirth, with nothing but persistence and faith. The king's mother, new power, new role. With Henry VII crowned, Margaret assumed a new identity, not Queen Mother, but My Lady the King's Mother. This title was deliberately crafted. It granted her royal precedence, sometimes even over the Queen herself, but without infringing on Elizabeth of York's status. Margaret maintained her own household, had her own seal and coat of arms, signed letters Margaret R., a sign of her authority and presence, was granted legal autonomy over her estates, a rare privilege for any woman, even of noble birth. Though she never remarried, she effectively operated as co-ruler in the shadows, offering guidance, managing court alliances, and quietly shaping her son's policies. Faith, learning, and legacy. In her later years, Margaret devoted herself to education and piety. She became a founder of institutions that still bear her name today. Among her most notable contributions, she founded Christ's College, Cambridge in 1505. She established St. John's College, Cambridge in 1511, completed after her death. She endowed schools for poor scholars and supported the translation of devotional texts into English. She employed a household chaplain named John Fisher, later Bishop of Rochester and a martyr under Henry VII. Her goal was clear: to shape the moral and intellectual character of England's future leaders, just as she had shaped her own son. Reflections of a Survivor. Margaret Beaufort's personal writings were few and her recorded speech cautious, but in the quiet margins of household accounts, legal charters, and dedications, we catch glimpses of her. In all things I sought to be both steadfast and obedient to God, to my King, and to the truth I knew. She had been a wife at 12, a mother at 13, a widow at 14. She never forgot the price of her early obedience, but she also never allowed it to define the limits of her mind. Margaret endured more than most women of her time, and she transformed that endurance into influence, not through warfare, but through unshakable will. Final days and death. Margaret died on June 29, 1509, just 2 months after the death of her son, Henry VII, and days after witnessing the coronation of her grandson, Henry VIII. She died in Westminster Abbey, buried near the shrine of St. Edward the Confessor. Her tomb, sculpted by the Renaissance artist Pietro Torrigiano, shows her in prayer, modest and composed just as she had lived. Beneath the stone lies not merely a queen's mother, but a quiet revolutionary who shaped England's destiny. How many others were silently powerful? Margaret Beaufort's story ends with triumph, but it begins with a child's body forced into a marriage bed. Her strength was forged in silence, her influence grown in shadow. Her life raises a question not easily answered. How many other women pushed into marriage, bent by the will of men, written off by history, quietly changed the course of nations? Story 6. The marriage market of monasteries, noble daughters and forced vows. You might imagine a medieval convent as a haven of piety and seclusion, a place where women chose to withdraw from the world in pursuit of spiritual enlightenment. And in some cases, that was true. But for many girls, especially daughters of the nobility, the cloister was not a sanctuary by choice. It was a marriage of convenience without a husband, a calculated transaction made by their families, and a lifelong commitment sealed before they could object. This story is not about saints or mystics, but about the ordinary girls, many of them teenagers or even younger, who were vowed into monastic life without consent, often as part of dynastic strategy, economic necessity, or political maneuvering. And once the convent gates closed behind them, there was little chance of return. Let us step into the silent corridors of 12th to 14th century Europe and walk alongside the forgotten daughters of noble houses, whose futures were determined not by choice, but by dowry, rank, and prayer books. The family economy: too many daughters, too little land. In a medieval noble household, inheritance laws favored sons. The eldest son received the lion's share of land and title. Second or third sons might enter the church or seek careers as knights. But daughters, they were costly investments. To marry a daughter, a nobleman had to provide a dowry in land, money, or goods, the promise of inheritance or connections, festivities, and negotiation. When a family had multiple daughters, the expenses multiplied, and if suitable husbands weren't available or politically useful matches couldn't be made, the alternative was obvious: the convent. Convent life was cheaper in the long term. A girl entering religious life required a smaller dowry, called an oblate offering to the abbey, and once inside, she no longer competed for the family inheritance. So quietly and effectively, the marriage market extended into monasteries. Except in this market, the bride never left the building. The vow before the voice, child oblation, and forced professions. Medieval canon law dictated that entry into monastic life should be voluntary. True, girls could take vows from age 12 and boys from 14, but the church officially taught that free will was essential to religious devotion. Yet the reality was murkier. Noble families frequently offered children, especially girls, as oblates, or spiritual gifts, to monasteries. This practice was common in both Benedictine and Cistercian houses. Some were sent as young as 5 or 6, raised entirely within cloister walls. Others were older girls sent under pressure, told it was the will of their parents or a form of duty. Refusal could mean shame, punishment, or disinheritance. Many did not understand the full weight of the vows they were making. A child might be dressed in a novice's robe, attend Latin prayers she didn't understand, sign a vow under supervision, be told it was God's will and that refusal was a sin. Was that truly consent? The church debated it. Bishops sometimes investigated forced professions, but the line between encouragement and coercion was conveniently blurry. A cloistered woman's world. What was life like for these noble girls once they were within the convent? That depended on the wealth and prestige of the house. Some convents, especially in France, the German states, and northern Italy, were wealthy institutions with dozens of nuns, abbesses, lay sisters, and servants. Within these walls, the noble-born were often granted privileges: private cells or quarters, superior food and clothing, access to books, music, and correspondence. They were also more likely to rise to positions of authority: abbess, prioress, or bursar. They could manage estates, oversee rents, and direct younger sisters. But for every noble abbess, there were dozens of lesser-born sisters. For them, the convent was a world of manual labor, tending gardens, kitchens, and almonries; strict discipline, silence, fasting, and punishments; limited literacy, especially in remote or poorer houses. Even for noble girls, convent life could feel like golden captivity: comfortable, yes, but unchosen. Sewn into the veil, ceremonies of final vows. When a girl was formally professed as a nun, a ceremony was held part sacred rite, part funeral. She would process into the chapel in fine garments, often symbolic of her worldly station. There she would remove her jewelry, lie prostrate before the altar, have her hair cut or covered, be dressed in a veil and habit. In some traditions, she wore a white dress like a bride. In others, she was covered in black like a widow. Either way, the symbolism was clear. She was now married to Christ. The community sang the Susait me Daman. Uphold me, O Lord, according to your promise, and I shall live. It was deeply spiritual, but it was also irreversible. While escape from monastic life was not impossible, it required papal dispensation, and that was rarely granted. Most girls who took the veil never left the convent again. Case study: Heloise the scholar forced to obey. Though best known for her tragic love affair with Peter Abelard, Heloise of Argenteuil offers a unique window into forced vocation. Heloise was a brilliant scholar, raised in the household of her uncle Fulbert. She and Abelard began a relationship around 1117, resulting in a child. Their affair scandalized Paris. When Fulbert discovered it, he forced Heloise into a convent, despite her protests. Abelard, in a misguided act of penance, encouraged her to stay and take vows. Heloise, devastated, wrote, "God knows I never sought anything in you but yourself. I would rather be your whore than his empress." Her letters reveal the bitterness of someone who took the veil under pressure, not devotion. She later became abbess of the Paraclete and a respected leader, but her early vows remained a wound. Heloise was exceptional in intellect, but her experience was not exceptional in outcome. The convent as school, prison, or sanctuary. Not all convent experiences were bleak. For some noble girls, especially those unsuited to marriage, disabled, or intellectually inclined, monastic life offered access to books and learning, a community of women, freedom from childbirth and male authority. Some became skilled illuminators, composers, chroniclers, or managers of large convent estates. Women like Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, and Harriet of Landsberg made names for themselves in religious scholarship. But those women chose their path. For many others, especially in the 13th and 14th centuries, the convent was simply the lesser of two burdens: unwanted marriage or no voice at all. Monastic corruption and noble pressure. By the late medieval period, monastic life was not always so pious. Powerful families sometimes bribed their daughters into abbess roles, bypassing elections and church regulations. Others kept daughters cloistered, but allowed them to live lavishly within the walls. Scandals emerged. Reports of abbesses riding horses, hosting feasts, or wearing jewels. Monasteries with private kitchens and private incomes for noble nuns. Convents acting as de facto noble courts, run by well-connected women. In response, reformers criticized the system, urging stricter discipline and more humility. But few questioned the practice of forced vocations. It was an accepted fact of noble life. What did they think when the doors closed behind them? As we peer back into the stone halls of those convents, some crumbling, some still standing, we're left wondering. What did those girls think as they knelt for vows they didn't write? What dreams did they abandon? What futures did they imagine, even as the veil fell across their faces? And did any of them alone in their cells, fingers tracing the worn edges of a psalter, ever whisper a question? If I had not been born to this name, would I be here? Inside the medieval cloister, life followed a rhythm all its own, ordered, repetitive, and deeply hierarchical. The bell marked the hours, not the sun. Meals were taken in silence, prayers whispered at dawn, and the outer world fell further and further away with each passing year. But beneath this quiet regularity, convents were not empty of politics. Power still mattered. Status still mattered. And for many noble daughters forced into religious life, their monastic journey was not an end to ambition, it was simply rechanneled. In this section, we will explore how noble women used their positions to gain authority, how monastic institutions became mirrors of noble society, and how women learned to negotiate influence within the constraints imposed on them. The hierarchy inside: not all nuns were equal. Contrary to popular belief, medieval convents were not communes of radical equality. Social stratification persisted behind the veil. Women of noble birth often brought significant dowries, and with them, expectations of higher status within the house. Key distinctions: choir nuns, often of noble background, were educated and participated fully in liturgical life. Lay sisters, often peasant girls, performed manual labor and had limited religious involvement. Extern sisters handled business outside the walls, interacting with secular society. Leadership positions were similarly structured. The abbess or prioress held supreme authority within the convent, both spiritual and administrative. Other roles included cellarer in charge of supplies, sacristan in charge of the chapel, and infirmarian responsible for health. For noble-born girls, these roles could become stepping stones to authority, especially if they had political connections outside the convent. Some even dominated entire regional economies through land management and tenant oversight. Convents, in other words, were not merely spiritual retreats, they were landed institutions, run by women. Convents as family branches, the noblewoman's back office. Many noble families treated convents as extensions of their dynastic network. Examples: a bishop's sister might be made abbess of a wealthy house. A duke might fund a convent where 2 or 3 daughters resided. A noblewoman might be placed in a convent near the family estate for convenience and influence. These placements weren't necessarily religious, they were strategic. And in some cases, women inside the convent acted as diplomatic go-betweens, hosting envoys, sending letters on behalf of powerful relatives, maintaining political networks through correspondence. The most prestigious abbeys had more than holy sisters, they had political operators in wimples, managing land, tenants, and litigation. As landholders, many convents managed farms and granges, tithes and rents from nearby villages, legal disputes in manorial courts. It was not uncommon for an abbess to act as a landlord and magistrate, settling tenant complaints, overseeing harvests, or engaging in lawsuits over disputed boundaries. In one 14th century case in northern France, a Benedictine abbess successfully sued a local baron over river rights. She argued from charters older than the baron's manor and won. Such cases illustrate how convents weren't passive spiritual institutions. They were fully enmeshed in the economic life of medieval society. And noble-born women, trained in household management and letter writing, were often well suited to the task. Art, music, and the written word, cultural power. Convents were also centers of cultural preservation and creation. For women denied access to universities or political offices, the cloister became a space to compose music, like Hildegard of Bingen's soaring chants, copy and illuminate manuscripts, write devotional or philosophical works, create drama, poetry, or history, often anonymously or pseudonymously. Some convents became famous for their choirs, attracting donations and noble patrons. Others cultivated reputations as schools for aristocratic girls, offering education alongside piety. This intellectual life gave women a voice through the pen, even if that voice remained within convent walls. Escape and resistance: not all vows held forever. While most women remained in their convents for life, some resisted subtly or directly. Examples of resistance included refusing to take final vows, stalling for years as a novice, writing appeals to bishops or popes, citing coercion, feigning illness or insanity to be released, running away though the consequences could be severe, excommunication, familial disgrace. In rare cases, women were released from their vows through papal dispensation, especially if the original vows had been taken too young or under duress. In the 15th century, a French woman named Jeanne de Valois, daughter of a royal line, successfully petitioned to leave the convent and marry a controversial but revealing case. Resistance wasn't easy, but it wasn't unheard of. Reform in decline, the convent in crisis. By the 14th and 15th centuries, monastic institutions were facing decline. Causes included economic hardship after the Black Death, moral criticism from reformers like the Lollards and Hussites, clerical corruption, including in abbeys and nunneries. Some convents became little more than retirement homes for noblewomen, their spiritual purpose diluted by wealth and comfort. Reform movements, including the observant branches of the Franciscans and Benedictines, sought to reimpose discipline. Stricter enclosures, greater emphasis on poverty and silence, removal of luxury and secular influence. But such reforms were often resisted by the very noblewomen who ran these houses, and who had no desire to relinquish their privileges. Thus, the convent became a battleground for the soul of monasticism, a struggle between piety, power, and property. What did the younger sisters see? In the shadow of these great abbesses and political managers, one must wonder, what did the younger, silent novices think? Did they dream of escape? Did they find comfort in routine? Or did they simply fade into obedience, carving out peace where they could? History often remembers the abbesses, the rulers, litigants, and scholars. But what of the girls who stitched altar cloths, swept kitchens, and died unknown in silence? Behind every abbess stood dozens of such women. Did any of them wonder, if I had been born without land, without title, would I be freer? By the dawn of the 16th century, the quiet endurance of thousands of cloistered women, noble-born or otherwise, was about to face an abrupt reckoning. What had long been a tolerated, even expected, fate for surplus daughters would now become a battleground for ideological, political, and religious reformers. As the Reformation swept across Europe, the institution of female monasticism, already fraying, was caught in the crosshairs. The ancient walls that once symbolized family honor and piety were now portrayed as prisons, and the women inside as victims of corruption, coercion, or idle comfort. This section explores how the convent system unraveled, what happened to the women within, and what remained of their power and voices when the gates finally opened. Unraveling the veil, the Protestant Reformation's assault. With Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517 came a new and dangerous idea, that monasticism was not a higher calling, but a false elevation of works over faith. The early Protestant reformers rejected the very idea of religious vows, especially those imposed on the young or unwitting. For noble daughters in cloisters, this meant seismic change. Reformers argued that vows taken in childhood were invalid, that celibacy was unnatural and contrary to God's design for women, that monasteries were parasitic institutions, draining wealth from the laity, that women, like men, should read scripture in their own language, not be locked away from the world. In Protestant territories, especially in parts of Germany, Scandinavia, and Switzerland, convents were closed, seized, or converted. Women who had lived for decades within their walls were suddenly faced with a question few had prepared for. What now? What happened to the nuns? The fates of these women varied widely, shaped by geography, age, and class. In Protestant regions, some nuns returned to their families, though many of those families had long ceased to exist. Some married, often to former monks or reform-minded clergy. Some formed women's religious communities without formal vows. Others lived in limbo, staying in convent buildings now repurposed as hospitals or schools, their spiritual lives unofficial but quietly persistent. For younger women, the change meant freedom but with uncertainty. For older nuns, it often meant displacement and loss. There are records of former nuns begging for food, writing desperate letters to local lords or magistrates asking for pensions or housing. Others embraced their new lives, finally allowed to own property, marry, or simply walk freely beyond the gates. But not all welcomed the shift. Some wrote of their grief, confusion, and identity collapse. The Catholic response: reform from within. Not all of Europe followed Luther's path. In Catholic territories, especially in Spain, Italy, and France, female monasticism was not abolished but reformed. The Council of Trent, 1545–1563, reaffirmed the value of monastic life, but also banned child ablation, no more vows before age 16, insisted on stricter enforcement of enclosure clausura, required diocesan oversight of abbeys, condemned abuses in dowry negotiations and power placements. New orders of nuns emerged with renewed purpose, not cloistered, but active in the world. The Ursulines focused on educating girls. The Daughters of Charity ran hospitals and orphanages. Later, the Visitandines blended contemplation with service. These were not medieval brides of Christ locked behind stone. They were modern Catholic women, living religious lives outside the walls without needing to marry or vanish from society. But in many places, the traditional convent endured refined, tightened but still powerful. Secularization and nationalization, the final blow. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the weakening of the Church's temporal power, combined with revolutionary fervor, brought further erosion to cloistered institutions. In France, during the Revolution, hundreds of convents were closed. Nuns were dispersed, arrested, or executed. Convent property was nationalized, sold, or destroyed. Some nuns refused to abandon their vows, gathering in secret to pray. Others assimilated quietly into the new world, often becoming teachers or midwives. By the early 1800s, in most Protestant countries and many secularizing Catholic ones, the image of the cloistered noble nun was more anachronism than reality. What had once been a widespread marital alternative for elite daughters had become a symbol of religious excess, viewed with suspicion or quaint nostalgia. What remained of their voices? Although most medieval nuns left no diaries or records, some did. Their writings offer us glimpses of inner spiritual struggles, frustrations with superiors or rules, quiet acts of resistance like reading forbidden texts or questioning unjust decisions, deep affection for their sisters and their community. One nun in 15th century Germany wrote, "I was given to the cloister like a coin to the offering plate. No one asked if I wished to stay." Another, decades later, reflected, "I have found peace here, but not from the world. The world finds its way in through every prayer, every parcel, every visitor. We are never truly away from it." These voices, rare and delicate, remind us that the women within the convent were not shadows. They thought, questioned, and remembered. The lasting legacy. Despite its decline, the system of forced female monasticism left behind. Architectural wonders, abbeys, chapels, and cloisters now used as museums or schools. Educational traditions. Many girls' schools trace their roots to former convents. Literary echoes in legends, plays, and historical accounts. Cultural norms on women's labor, literacy, and celibacy that lingered for centuries. In modern times, scholars have reevaluated the lives of these women, not as mere victims but as agents within constraints, crafting meaning, finding purpose, and sometimes shaping policy from within walls not of their choosing. They were never free in the modern sense, but they were far from powerless. A quiet marriage to silence. The convent was called a bride house, a place where women were married to Christ. But for many noble daughters, the cloister was less a wedding than a burial not of the body, but of the will. And yet buried things sometimes grow roots. The medieval monastic woman, though silenced in life, whispers still in records, ruins, and reform. Her story asks us, what choices are truly our own? And how do we live meaningfully when our lives are chosen for us?